Glimlag, mevrou Botha.
Dis nie my platform nie, dis David Meynie se platform vanmiddag.
Want wat vir hy Weskus snoek om Kaap toe te stap, Botha?
Right, good afternoon all. It is 2 o'clock. A very warm welcome to this Provincial Parliament Ad Hoc Committee on COVID-19. Today we are reviewing two themes. The first is government finances relating to the COVID pandemic, and the second is cooperative governance, also relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Mireille Wenger and I'm the chairperson of this committee. We'd like to welcome all members present, as well as Minister Meynie and the head of the Provincial Treasury, as well as officials in attendance. I'd also like to welcome Ms. Klutter and Ms. Adams, who are the senior and procedural officers for this committee. We'd also like to welcome members of the public and members of the media that are joining us on social media today. Starting with apologies, I have received one apology from Honourable Danville Smith. Are there any other apologies? None. If I could just get an indication if there are any alternate members standing in.
Chair?
Yes?
Member Bululama Mvimbi is an alternate member standing for Member Danville Smith. Thank you.
We've noted that. Thank you very much, Honourable Lecker. I'm going to just start with the rules of engagement, which some of you are very familiar with, but for those that are not, all members were muted at the beginning of this meeting to avoid background noises. Members are to please raise their hands using the new raise your hand function if they would like to raise a point of order. If they do not have this function on their system, you can do so by using the chat function. I ask that the chat function be used exclusively for raising points of order and not for any other purpose. We ask that all members switch off their video and microphone during the course of the meeting, which will assist with a clear connection. However, if a member, minister or official is speaking, please do use your microphone and video. And once you have finished speaking, if you would then switch them off. We also ask that departments that are presenting be responsible for sharing the presentation on the screen. The structure of today's meeting is divided into two. We had many submissions on the government finance theme and very few submissions on the cooperative governance theme. The letters of invitation were sent some time ago. Members, I just want to flag that the letters of invite were sent before we implemented our new system of putting all presentations together with questions after. And given the few inputs received for the second theme, we asked the Premier and DG to join us just before 4 o'clock in this meeting. So we will start with Minister Meynie and the Treasury. Thank you, Minister. This is your second opportunity before us, but the first for the Treasury. We will have a 40-minute presentation based on the submissions from the members, and we will have questions of 1 hour. We'll then have a 20-minute presentation from the Premier and the DG with just short of an hour for that theme. So without further ado, Minister Meynie, please be welcome to you and your team. If you'd like to make some introductory remarks and then move on to the presentation. We had asked that you and your department provide us with information on financing and budgeting for this pandemic, as well as the provincial reserve funds, goods and services provided under emergency procurement regulations, PPE, as well as Treasury's management of the relevant departments and the impact that the pandemic is having on government finances. So with that as an introduction, welcome, Minister, over to you. You seem to be on mute. Still nothing? Sorry, Minister, we can't hear you. Okay, I see Minister is probably going to leave and rejoin. If we'll just give him one moment.
We need a sign language interpreter, please.
No, for whatever reason, it's staying muted. Minister, I'm afraid we can see you, but we can't hear you. I wonder if IT can assist as to why Minister Mania cannot be unmuted.
Chair, I think he was on and we could hear him. He was in a conversation before the meeting started.
Okay, he's going to leave and rejoin. Okay, we can see Minister, but it seems that he's still on mute. Nope. I can see on the control panel that it's muted, but for whatever reason it can't be unmuted. Do we have IT on the line that can assist?
Yes, we are. Minister, can you press F10 on your keyboard if you're using a Mac? Okay, we will assist. I think it's just if you're using a Mac to press F10.
It doesn't seem to be working. Apologies, if we could just be patient for a few moments. IT is assisting Minister.
A moment. Great. Chairperson, I do apologize. I was saying that I wanted to make some brief opening remarks and then hand over to David Savage, the head of Provincial Treasury. Is that in order?
Yes, of course. Please proceed.
Thank you. And you can hear me loud and clear?
We can hear you loud and clear. Thank you at last.
Great. Thank you, and I do apologize for the technical glitch. Chairperson, I wanted to take members back to the 2020 budget earlier this year, which of course now feels like an age ago, when we were only at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis and when there were no known infections in the Western Cape. And I recall in my budget speech noting that Provincial Treasury had made provision for unanticipated events and that we stood ready to support the Department of Health should COVID-19 reach the Western Cape. Those were my words. And of course, at the time, we could not have imagined the size and the scale of what we would face, nor I think the implications for the provincial budget, which will require us to make very deep budget cuts in the Western Cape. We are currently projecting, and bear in mind these figures are going to change over time, a 610 million rand own revenue shortfall, at least a 3 billion rand provincial budget cut, and expenditure demands to fund the COVID-19 response of at least 2.4 billion rand in the Western Cape. To date, we have committed 1.14 billion rand towards COVID-19 related expenditure in the Western Cape, which includes, but of course is not limited to, 628 million rand to the Department of Health for personal protective equipment, laboratory tests, hospital beds and ventilators. 273 million rand to the Department of Education for personal protective equipment, again, thermometers, sanitizers and cleaning materials. 168 million rand to the Department of Transport and Public Works for the setup of quarantine and isolation facilities, and also, of course, the field hospital at the Cape Town International Convention Centre. And 35 million rand to the Departments of Social Development and 18 million rand to the Department of Education for the initial humanitarian response. And then, of course, 16.2 million rand to the Department of Local Government, again, to support the humanitarian response in municipalities throughout the Western Cape. We have also been working hard to identify and reprioritize all non-essential expenditure towards our immediate expenditure needs, particularly in the Department of Health and Social Development. We continue each week to engage at a technical level and with the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, so that we ensure that our actions are aligned with national government. And of course, this week we kicked off our budget process, where we are working towards a mid-year adjustments budget in response to the COVID-19 crisis, which of course will follow the supplementary budget, which will be tabled by national government sometime in June in the National Assembly. Chairperson, in closing, I can assure you that the Provincial Treasury has been working around the clock to support the whole of government response to COVID-19 in the Western Cape. And with that, through you, Chair, if I could hand over to David Savage, who is the head official at Provincial Treasury, to take us through the presentation.
Thank you very much, Minister. Welcome to you, Mr. Savage. Just a reminder of the 40-minute time period for the presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I will absolutely do my best. I'm just putting this up on the screen, and if you could confirm that you can see the presentation, that would be useful.
Confirmed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have attempted from the Provincial Treasury side to respond specifically to each of the questions that have been raised, and we'll go through them, I think, more or less in that order, while not limiting specifically to that, to make sure that we provide the committee with the broader context. So I think, as the Minister has already noted, we are dealing with an unprecedented environment of both economic and fiscal uncertainty at present. Globally, the massive global economic contraction is projected now for 2020. The second quarter of the calendar year is likely to bring greater economic disruption across the globe. There's massive financial market volatility, there are resurgent trade tensions, and there's a lot of sentiment rather than hard data that is driving risk assessments in the market. It's very clear that the global economic recovery is going to be dependent on the pandemic pathways across varying countries, and they do seem to be taking slightly different pathways. The efficacy of public health measures that are taken in response, whether they're containment or particularly vaccine development, the extent of actual economic disruption to supply chains and productivity losses through to lockdowns, and then globally also the nature, scale, and extent of coordination of a global economic policy response. In South Africa, the contraction in the economy comes on the back of what we already knew about structural weaknesses in our domestic economy. There are projections that are continually being revised of growth between -5.8% and -7.4% in the current year. We do know that revenue forecasts at the national level are collapsing and continually being restated. Some early statements a few months ago, members might remember, had revenue shortfalls of national government of about 130 billion. They were raised to 210 billion, now sitting at around 285 billion rand shortfall in revenue for the national government. That, for some perspective, is about 250% of the Western Cape budget, or 2.5 Western Capes. That is revenue forgone in this year. The deficit is now projected at 11.6% in 2021, or just over 500 billion rand at a national level, and it's likely that the debt to GDP ratio will explode from 69% in the previous year to 91% by 2023 and 93% by 2025. That, of course, raises debt service costs already at a little under 20% of total public spending, or 5% of GDP. In the Western Cape, we've of course been watching the situation extremely closely and working with our colleagues in the Department of Economic Development and Tourism are trying to track the impacts as it may manifest across the provincial economy, not only in the economic sectors, but also crucially on employment. Early results, and I must emphasize that these are early results, and our projections are still, and our assumptions are still being stress tested, and our projections are changing as new data comes in, is that tourism and construction sectors are going to be hit very, very hard, significant job losses, but that on the brighter side, agriculture might hold up well, particularly if there's a resumption in international agricultural exports, and if there is continued rand weakness that may play in our favor. The work that we are doing is obviously to update this model to give us better medium-term forecasts as well, and to also localize these models so that our municipal areas in particular are able to get a more nuanced understanding of the impact that this will have on their own jurisdictions and on their own budgets at a municipal level. We've also, as the Minister have noted, been working very closely with the National Treasury to better understand the national fiscal response and its impacts on provincial governments. Members will have heard that the President Ramaphosa had announced a national fiscal response package of 500 billion rand. It is very important to note that the vast majority of that package is targeted to be transferred directly to households and firms from the national sphere. There's really only 40 billion rand that was announced for provinces and municipalities, and the Western Cape's allocation within that is unclear at this point. We are estimating that in terms of the health response, should the full 20 billion rand be allocated amongst provinces, that the Western Cape may get anywhere between 1.5 and a little over 2 billion rand. That's an early estimate. I must clarify this. There's no formal indication as yet from national government. Municipalities, there's unfortunately not yet any clarity on the scope of that funding in terms of what it can be used for, or the mechanism for the transfer of that funding. We do know that 7.9 million rand has been allocated in the 2019-20 municipal financial year, which closes in June, but that amounted to just a little under 8 million rand across our municipalities. We do also know from the national sphere that, and President Ramaphosa's announcement, that 130 billion rand of the 500 billion rand package will be financed from reprioritization, including 30 billion rand from provinces. If we were to take that just and apply that 30 billion rand in terms of the Western Cape share based on the provincial equitable share formula, that would amount to nearly 3.1 billion rand that the Western Cape would be required to generate in savings. There are significant risks in all of this and uncertainties related to national policy and national budget strategy, which, as you can well imagine, is being actively worked on by the National Treasury, and they're not always able to share with us information as frequently as they would like, because they're constrained by some of their own processes. We do, however, from the Western Cape Provincial Treasury side, we've identified certain national budget developments and risks. A particular risk for all spheres of government is that around functional assignments. Which sphere of government is responsible for the various aspects of the disaster response? There's obviously a risk that if there is an assigned function that is not performed by one sphere or performed without clear mandate by another sphere, there's a phenomenon that's known as fiscal offloading, where one sphere can essentially impose its own expenditure obligations onto another sphere of government. That's something that does need to be actively managed, and is something we as the Provincial Treasury track closely and guide actively on. The revenue forecasts are another issue. We are hoping that any cuts to the provincial equitable share will be decided by next week. Certainly at a technical level, that'll give us very critical planning guidance going forward in terms of the scope of the cuts that we might have to accommodate as part of the 130 billion rand national reprioritization exercise. We're also hopeful that we're going to get increased guidance on what impacts there will be on conditional grants. At the moment, it appears that the impacts on conditional grant funding that the province receives will be variable, but it remains generally unclear as to what those impacts will be. On the expenditure management side, there are a number of risks that remain within the current fiscal year. Obviously, the impact of wage increases for public servants, both at the national and provincial spheres, but also in terms of the municipal sphere, have a very significant impact, particularly on provincial government budgets. There are emerging impacts in terms of regulatory compliance across departments, say, for example, school readiness, or preparing even our own administrative buildings and facilities for staff to return to work. Often meeting those requirements, the costs of that are not fully known, and when working through the regulations, it appears that those costs are relatively high and rising. There's also, of course, emerging labor conflicts over return to work arrangements and the provision of PPE, personal protective equipment, the masks and so forth, which is of course a concern in terms of also the ability of government to continue to perform its functions at the desired standards. In terms of the budget process at a national level, we have some indication from national government that there will be an early national adjustments budget process on or around the 24th of June. That's a critical date marker for the Western Cape and any budget processes that we might undertake. And there's still consultation with the National Department of Performance Monitoring, Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in terms of the status and procedures for the adjustments of annual performance plans for departments if appropriate, because that's obviously tightly linked to the budget adjustment process. In terms of our COVID-19 approach as the Provincial Treasury, at an operational level, in order to support a financial and supply chain response to the disaster across the provincial government, we have worked very closely. We've in fact brought one of the our top supply chain management leadership into the fore of managing the provincial-wide response, and we have divided our attention into 4 critical streams, dealing with accommodation and medical admissions, community food security, medical supply and services, and looking at economic impact analysis and forecasting. That is intended to provide, that works across the clusters of the provincial government response, and aggregates its work in a central procurement advisory committee that is chaired by the Provincial Treasury. It has a oversight, guidance, and in some limited cases an approval role for processing particular transactions to assist accounting officers to respond very quickly and efficiently while remaining compliant with regulatory requirements. There've been a blizzard, I would say, of guidance circulars related to the Disaster Management Act, but also to the Public Finance Management Act and the Municipal Finance Management Act, and the role of this committee in providing those advisory services and interpretations is invaluable. We are wanting to make sure that we are conducting proactive checks in order to pick up on and preferably prevent, in all instances, any irregularities with emergency procurement and expenditures related to COVID-19, advise how we can use some of the lessons we're learning on the provincial side for the benefit of our municipalities. We're looking specifically at the donations environment to make sure that any and all donations can be properly accounted for, and that there is solid governance processes followed in terms of any budget cuts and other criteria in that respect. In terms of our COVID-19, whoops, I'm going in the wrong direction. I do apologize. In order to support this work, in the Provincial Treasury, we have helped to establish a COVID-19 related data nerve center that helps to bring evidence-based decision-making to the fore, to expand the availability of varying sources of data on the epidemiological side, on the humanitarian relief and community vulnerability side, on personal protective equipment and the management of our supply chain, and on financial and financial matters into an integrated framework to assist with decision making. We're rolling this out in an incremental manner, focusing on our key information gaps, but ultimately looking to build a dynamic forecasting capacity across our data modules linked to real-time data and our provisioning needs in the province. We're thinking this will have a lasting impact on Western Cape government operations as well. We are continually revising our management model for this and making sure that we're leveraging available systems and capabilities across the provincial government, in fact, even across the public sector. Been working very closely with some of the capabilities of the City of Cape Town in this respect and non-governmental sectors. I am going to hand over to my colleague Isaac Smith, who has been at the forefront of coordinating the response to take us through some of the requests for additional financing and some of our supply chain responses. But this table effectively summarizes the particular requests for reprioritization of expenditures that would require some Treasury intervention, including emergency expenditures that have been authorized in terms of Section 25 of the PFMA, which you can see is relatively limited at this point, but has been done in record time. Isaac, can I hand over to, can I hand over to Annalise Pick in this respect?
Thank you, Chair. Members, Minister. Yes, as the HOT has indicated, we have had various requests thus far from departments, also noting that there is still huge uncertainty in some of the major frontline departments regarding expenditure, so that and the Provincial Treasury is working closely with those departments in terms of costing the various impacts that they would have on the departments in terms of frontline. But in the meantime, these are the requests that we have received thus far and that we have approved as a Provincial Treasury. In terms of the Department of the Premier, COVID-19 requires communication, and as being the communication hub for the province, we have seen in terms of they have an amount of about 15 million rand. And then also in terms of the call centers, in terms of the provincial call centers, we needed to increase capacity there as well. So the total for reprioritization that has been approved within the Department of the Premier is about 16 million rand. Then in terms of humanitarian relief, and this from an education perspective for school feeding scheme, that was approved also on the 4th of April. And that is in terms of to make sure that there's approximately 1,000 schools that will continue the food feeding scheme in terms of the National School Nutrition Grant. And at that stage, when we had to make that decision, no decision was made at a national level of whether we could access the national funding. And therefore, the minister then agreed in terms of Section 25 to make sure that we can continue those feeding programs. And the 18 million was approved for that in terms of Section 25. Then in terms of the Department of Health, in terms of the disaster relief grant at a national level, we have accessed that the entire health sector. There was 466 million rand available, and we accessed 53 million of that 466 million rand. Regarding further humanitarian relief in terms of Department of Social Development, yes, in terms of food parcels, and then also in terms of increasing the number of cooked meals to the existing feeding schemes within the Department of Social Development, there was total reprioritization into the value of 35 million rand. And as the HOT has indicated in terms of the Department of Local Government, in terms of a support grant to municipalities, also for humanitarian relief initiatives within municipalities, there was in terms of a reprioritization of 16.2 million rand for various municipalities. So in all, as the minister has indicated, when he announced the budget when he tabled the budget in March, He also indicated that there is a reserve of unforeseen and unavoidable, which is also seen as a Section 25 in terms of in case of emergencies. And that value is, the total amount is 208 million. So thus far, we have accessed 18 million rand from that reserve, meaning that there's 190 million at this stage. Noting the uncertainties that the HOT has indicated, and also noting that with this disaster, that we are in terms of, we are showing in terms of increasing expenditures that we still will see and will be requested mainly by the Department of Health, and then also in terms of quarantine and isolation costs, and then also some further humanitarian costs that will be coming through. When we look at the expenditure thus far, and the expenditure we're showing here in this slide includes in terms of the actual expenditure as at 19th of May, but also the commitments the department has indicated that they have ordered supplies, but has not yet been delivered and therefore has not been paid as yet. But with this disaster, it is important for us to have a handle in terms of what is also in terms of our commitment register. So when we're reporting for you on this disaster, which is different from other disasters, we're doing the total in terms of commitments, and that amount is to 1.1 billion rand thus far. And you'll see also that this increases every week. For this week, what we see is that there is an increase. If the presentation, sorry, the slide. Thank you. And then in this case, what we're seeing is that the increase in expenditure now, as we expect health to be the main contributor to the expenditure, about 55%. We see now that obviously the Department of Education, with the schools going back to school, their expenditure is increasing, as well as the Department of Transport and Public Works in terms of materials for sanitizing offices, and then also masks and thermometers for both Transport and Public Works and Education. As expected, the driver within this expenditure, so almost 82% of that 1.1 billion is towards goods and services, and that is in the purchasing within the health sector, in terms of nebulizers, in terms of masks, but also in terms of our personal protection equipment, and then also in terms of linen and sanitizing equipment for the hospitals, but also then to equip our offices when we do go back, and more importantly also for schools when the schools start opening up for the scholars. You'll see also over the weeks, you can see in terms of how, in terms of the various departments, how that expenditure has increased week on week, and that you can see now the acceleration within especially the Education and Transport and Public Works in the last week, where that has increased quite significantly.
Thank you very much, Annelies. On emergency procurement, I'm going to hand over to Isaac Smith to quickly take us through some of the emergency procurement developments. Isaac?
Thank you, David, and good afternoon.
I'm sorry, Isaac, before we go, Chair, could I just get a time check, because I'm aware we may be running out of time.
Certainly. You have 16.5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
So Chair, I think it's just important maybe just to give you a rundown in terms of our procurement environment, so that you can also understand the slides that will follow. And Annelies have also indicated that we spend more than 1.1 billion, and basically all of those expenses were generated via and commitments via the procurement system. Within the Western Cape, we've got a hybrid between centralized and decentralized system. Most of the activities actually happens within the department. So when we do procurement, we have, of course, got transversal contracts that we arrange ourselves, or either via the National Treasury, and then departments engage in most of those procurement transactions. What we've done over the last 7 to 8 years is particularly develop an emergency procurement environment. So all of the departments have emergency procurement policies. So when the COVID-19 started, you know, they were already ready to start with the procurement processes. So what we also have been using is our e-procurement system. That seems to work quite well with the emergencies, and quite a number of transactions also run through that system. So apart from the e-procurement system and the transversal contracts, this is just a reflection on some of the more bigger amounts that comes through to the Treasury, where we actually also support the departments and look at the regularity environment, and to ensure that, you know, that when they engage with these transactions, that there are no risk as far as that is concerned. It is a requirement that particular for contracts above 1 million within the COVID environment, that the departments consult with the Treasury, and of course we support the departments as far as that is concerned. So those items that you see there, it's the bigger items that we've given support to the departments thus far, in addition to what they've already done through the emergency procurement policies. Next slide. David, can you run the slides? Sorry, yeah, next one. This slide basically just gives you an indication in terms of the e-procurement system that we're using, in particular under PPP. Apart from the national contracts and also our own health contracts, we're using the e-procurement system to purchase PPPs as well. We found initially when we started with the procurement system, and still even now, you know, that there's a shortage of supplies in the market. So what we've done, we've accessed the market and put as many as possible suppliers of the PPP on our e-procurement system with the prices. And what the departments are doing is actually use that system to ensure that, you know, they purchase from those suppliers that have stock at that particular point in time. As you can see, already 665 transactions has been generated via the system. And then also, as far as the procurement for essential workers are concerned, contracts to the value of the next slide of 20 million has already been executed. Next slide. As indicated by Annelies, most of the commitments thus far is through some of the major departments, and of course the one item that is picking up quite a lot, apart from just looking at essential health workers, is the PPE. And you'll see that the transactions have increased quite a lot over the last 2 weeks or so, in particular including the cloth masks. And there's a huge cry as far as cloth masks is concerned. And with regard to that, we've also ensured that we've put the database together of Western Cape suppliers that are able to supply the cloth masks to our institutions. Next slide. This is basically just to give you an indication in terms of all the orders placed by the various departments. Once the regulations for level 4 have been issued, it was a requirement that departments prepare themselves for coming back to work. And since then, a lot of orders have been placed for sanitizers, for PPE, to ensure that, you know, when the workers start working, that the different departments have ensured that we adhere to all the requirements as indicated in the regulations. Next slide. This slide is just also to give you an indication in terms of lining up to what Annelies have said, in terms of the number of orders that has been placed. 87% was in respect of PPP. Of course, there is quite a bit also as far as food is concerned. And then you'll see there's a 16 million as far as other categories of purchases are concerned. So that slide just gives you a further breakdown in terms of what we've done thus far in terms of ensuring that departments can easily, you know, buy these particular items on the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. The committee had also asked us on the extent of cooperation with textile, manufacturing, agriculture, and agri-processing sectors. This we collaborate and support, in fact, the Department of Economic Development and Tourism in their sector support programs. We are and they have been really leading the provincial government's work in unpacking availability of disaster relief funding for sectors and channeling submissions through the work of Minister Mania, in particular for particular sectors regarding the risk-adjusted lockdown level strategy. They've also been working on red tape constraints, for example, in wine exports, and we've been collaborating actively on research and data in the economic sphere needed for planning and decision making. This is increasingly being integrated with the province's transversal hotspot management approach, and is being used also in the development of an economic recovery strategy, which is still underway. There's also, I think, been ad hoc support provided to these sectors as well, in terms of understanding legislation, disaster management regulations, exports constraints, and so forth. But we would recommend that if the committee would like further information on this, they would be better advised by Department of Economic Development and Tourism in this respect. Impact on the tourism sector. We do know, as I'd mentioned in some of the earlier modelling, that the lockdown has a massive impact on our local tourism sector, which is a very significant sector, economic sector in this province, both in terms of its contribution to gross value added, but also in terms of its employment opportunities that are offered. There are national. Currently, we're projecting that there'll be virtually no international tourism for 12 months from the start of the lockdown, and the economy could shed a very significant number of tourism jobs. It could be up to 43% of all Western Cape job losses on tourism and tourism related activities, and firms themselves, many small micro and medium-sized enterprises will come under extreme pressure, or already under that pressure. The role of providing relief in terms of broader fiscal relief that is available to these firms and to workers is a function that is led by national government and is thus integrated into the national disaster response package. The province is thus supporting the firms to access those packages, including the UIF packages for support to their workforces, and interpreting regulations and aggregating the views of operators to make sure that they get known by national government in the performance of its regulatory functions. I'd like to now move on to the provincial budget, and this is obviously something that deeply concerns the provincial treasury. We are, as we'd earlier pointed out, acutely aware that we are facing unparalleled budget pressure. We need to accommodate revenue reductions, both in terms of own revenue and grants from national government, transfers from national government, as well as expenditure growth. These numbers are not firm numbers that we're giving you here, as I've indicated earlier, but we are currently estimating that collectively the revenue reductions and additional expenditures we're going to have to accommodate collectively will amount to around 6 billion rand in the current financial year, while still facing the pressure of maintaining our existing service standards. The revenue reductions of about 3.6 billion coming in terms of our initial projections, largely from the provincial equitable share reduction, but also projected own revenue reductions. This doesn't account, as I mentioned earlier, for either changes in conditional grants or new health financing that may be available to us, as I'd mentioned on earlier slides. On the 3rd of May, we were projecting that our disaster-related expenditure demands would be a little over 2 billion rand in this fiscal year. We now have revised that up to to nearly 2.5 billion rand. Obviously, medical accommodation is a significant driver of that. That's both for hospital beds, including field hospitals, as well as quarantine and isolation facilities. Our humanitarian response we model at its current level. We do not have additional data on additional humanitarian response funding needs at this point, and PPE we are modeling it being over R500 million. That is this modeling is just that. It is modeling based on assumptions, based on some cost ceilings of what can be achieved in quarantine, isolation, and personal protective equipment provision, and does not yet include any additional humanitarian relief, remembering that national government is providing direct humanitarian relief through the social grants and related systems. And importantly, this does not include the response, the cost of any additional economic response package as we recover from the disaster. We are also keeping keenly in mind non-COVID related risks of additional disasters that may still occur in the province. The floods, fires, droughts, plagues, and even growing social unrest that may require a response. So we have to keep our mind on a double disaster, as it were, from unrelated sources potentially to the COVID-19 national disaster. So there are multiple cost drivers which are fluid. They're varying over time. The probabilities of them occurring are continuously changing, and this requires us to be very flexible in terms of our strategy and to remain aware of unanticipated risks, which cannot be considered as part of our current costing, making this an extraordinarily difficult fiscal year to manage. Our approach in this regard is to work from the baseline budget that has been adopted by the provincial legislature, but we will have to execute at least two major shifts, adjustments to this budget in this financial year, in our estimation. In the first instance, what we're calling an immediate phase, we are undertaking an ongoing situational analysis and are going to look at where we can find expenditure savings that may emerge from the lockdown and opportunities for immediate reprioritization of resources to support the front line of our disaster response, and we will execute that as and when required through invoking the procedures for emergency expenditures in terms of Section 25 of the PFMA, which we have done already in a limited number of instances, and we stand ready to do as and when required in compliance with the legal processes. We are hoping that this immediate phase, we're targeting that this immediate phase would lead us to a first adjusted budget for this year by the end of July. Simultaneously, we are going to initiate work on what we call a short-term 2020 budget reprioritization, which will take a strategy-led review of the programs and projects of departments and entities in parallel between the votes themselves and collectively with the Provincial Treasury and the Department of the Premier to analyze this provincial strategic plan, to understand opportunities to reprioritize, delay, or terminate programs, not only in the strategic plan where it's appropriate, but more deeply across government. And we're intending, therefore, to bring a second adjustments budget to Cabinet and then to the House in November. A third phase of the process is to undertake a further deeper review of the provincial strategy and to make the organizational and operational adjustments that are necessary for us to remain fiscally sustainable over the long term. And that we are intending to have the outlines of in the medium-term budget policy statement, and for initial implementation to start in the 2021 budget medium-term expenditure framework. We have recently issued Budget Circular 1 to departments that outlines this process, and have introduced some cost containment measures to generate immediate savings across the province. We've requested all accounting officers to deeply review the impact of the COVID-19 on service delivery, and to identify savings from areas such as lockdown. We are conducting our own parallel immediate savings exercise, and we will consult and reconcile the outcomes with departments of their processes in the as part of this process. We're looking at where we can find personnel savings within current recruitment processes, including the necessity of limitations to additional recruitment processes in this year. We're looking at entertainment allowances, catering costs, venue hire costs. We're looking at reducing advertising budgets for employment and procurement purposes, printing costs for internal documentation, accommodation costs, but noting the growing regulatory requirements of making our facilities safe for a return to work. We're looking at consultant and contractor costs, all non-mandatory training budgets and bursary schemes. We're looking at the purchasing and replacement of vehicles and other minor assets. We're re-looking at all transfers to municipalities, both grants and agency payments. We're looking at contractual commitments that can be safely and effectively renounced where appropriate. And we're looking closely at functions that are shared or duplicated across departments and or spheres of government. This is not to say that we are freezing all of these items or eliminating them entirely. We don't believe that a blunt approach is appropriate. For example, venue hire costs are quite critical to the national examinations process, and vehicles, as another example, are critical to the performance of provincial traffic services functions. So one cannot adopt a cross-the-board approach, but one does need to dive very deeply into this to contain expenditures robustly, and that is exactly what we are currently doing. So the key dates.
Mr. Savage, if you
Yes.
could use the next 2 or 3 minutes to wrap up, please. Thank you.
Yes, I can indeed. This is just the tabling of this is a broad timeline for the process that I'd outlined, and the final area that I think the committee wanted some information was on municipal performance. We've just issued our third quarter in-year monitoring report to the third quarter of the municipal financial year to the 31st of March. It showed calm before the storm with some known problems, but there were persistent liquidity risks in a number of municipalities that we were concerned about and already in dialogue with municipalities about. We do have relatively sustainable cash positions in most of our municipalities. High total outstanding debt, but but very little intergovernmental debt, mainly from households. There are some municipalities that, as at March 2020, we regard as exposed to liquidity risks. We are in discussions with each of them. They're not all in the same circumstances or facing risks that are driven by that have the same underlying reasons. So that's an active conversation that we have. We have a municipal strategy, a support mechanism in place with the Department of Local Government that aims to support our municipalities in that respect. The final question that was asked by the committee, Chairperson, if you would just give me an extra minute, was around the public-private partnership framework. in terms of working closely with social partners. And I think in this response to the national disaster, we're learning the importance of these partnerships more than ever before. In the NGO sector, there are productive, robust partnerships, particularly in supporting vulnerable households. We do have a formal PPP framework, but that does not include social partnerships, as it were, with NGOs. And there are obstacles to inclusion of service providers, and there's no formal process regarding the classification of these civil society structures. The Auditor General is leading an initiative now to consider obstacles from a financial management perspective for these broader social partnerships, and to ensure that any agreements disclose appropriate secondary financial information. And we're hoping to revise a framework to incorporate relationships with social partners as agreements to be audited by the Auditor General. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savage, for having prepared all the information in response to the committee's queries. And as I mentioned at the outset, there were quite a number of them. So thank you very much for having put all of that information together. We'll now move to a round of questions. As usual, we'll do 3-minute rounds per party. I'm going to start then with the DA. Are there any questions from the DA?
Deirdre Bartman. I will be splitting the time with Honourable Mackenzie. My first question is regarding slide 3. It was mentioned that there's a possibility that between 1.5 and 2.08 billion out of the 20 billion rand will be for the Western Cape in terms of health assistance from national. I did a quick calculation. This seems to be 10.4%. And if one had to, for example, divide money between provinces equally, that would be about 11%. But that would also not be equitable because the Western Cape and Gauteng has had more hectic impacts on COVID impacts on it than other provinces. I just want to understand how the Provincial Treasury and the Minister felt about that. Then I wanted to find out, I read that about 28 doctors are being sent to the Western Cape from national from Cuba, and it was reported that it's going to cost 440 million rand. And I just want to understand, who is paying for the doctors to come to the Western Cape? National, Western Cape, and what will that money be for? Slide 26. How much of that 610 million rand that might be lost is specifically gambling, patient fees, and licensing? And for example, you spoke about entertainment. What specific things will be cut? Is it a moratorium, or it's just like looking at cutting spending? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Honourable Bartman. Honourable Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm just on mute quickly. Thank you very much, Chairperson. On the national fiscal response package was specifically aimed at COVID-19. And just to follow up on my question, has there been discussion with National Treasury, for example, on the 20 billion going to province, what formula they're going to use? I know you said that they haven't shared as much information that you'd like. So I'm just keen to know if you had a discussion, what formula they're going to use. And then I want to go to a slide that I find very interesting. I think it's slide number 11, and that regards to procurement. The quantities, and I don't know what the quantities and the sizes of these things, but a simple mathematical formula, for example, thermometers in transport and public works, 230,000 divided by 100, that comes to 2,300 rand. The Department of the Premier, 14,000 divided by 150, come to 96 rand per unit. The mask in transport works in public, for example, 57,400,000 masks, 14 rand a unit. Department of the Premier, 22,000 rand, 300 masks, 74 rand a unit. So I'm just trying to get an understanding that the numbers are in these. Is that per box or quantity? Because if I just do the basic mathematical formulas, divide by the amount to purchase and divide by quantity, there's no consistency. Education, for example, based on these numbers, are paying 486 rand a mask. yet the Department of Agriculture, based on this numbers, are paying 15 Rand a mask. So just give clarity, and also in community safety, there is no quantities in. So if we can just get a clear explanation on this particular slide, is that per box, per individual unit? Because if I just do the numbers, the consistency per unit doesn't add up. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honourable Mackenzie. I will now move to the ANC. Are there any questions from the ANC, please?
Chair, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Honourable Nkondlo. Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson, and thanks for the opportunity. Chair, I think let me welcome the presentation and also I think the detailed from the HOD and the team, including the minister. And I think this is one I think conversation that is very critical in the make or break, you know, of state finances to carry this particular lockdown. And with the presentation, I think some of the questions that I had have been responded, and I want to thank, I think, the team around that. The couple of ones I wanted to check. One, I understand that from the presentations we've had, the province, especially the Provincial Treasury, has actually managed a particular fiscal strategy that have always, you know, presented to us in terms of maintaining, you know, and sustaining our fiscal environment. And I want, as it has been already presented, I just want to get an understanding of which are the areas, especially in that fiscal framework, that had to be disrupted. And I'm saying here, amongst others, you know, is your fiscal spending, you know, and I think the HODs mentioned one of the slides about some of the things that are gonna, you know, cut spending. But maybe if you can just take me through around that, you know, in terms of the broad framework of Provincial Treasury. Number two, in terms of the spending, again, I see, you know, in the money that has been given to, I think, almost 3 departments on food. One of the concerns that I have, which I think the department can respond to, is where almost 3 departments are spending on food, whether uncooked food. And I'm asking myself, in terms of that particular spending, aren't we seeing, you know, some kind of efficiencies that could actually be drawn, you know, if we were to consider a different way of spending? And I'm raising closer to what Honourable Mackenzie has just raised, because one has been seeing how, you know, from a councillor, you know, in a municipality to actually the entire municipality or a particular unit will be buying, you know, a mask at different prices. So how is that managed in terms of consolidating, you know, the limited budgets that we're having, including the second aspect for me is the whole spending, which is more on social relief. And I think one of the issues I've been raising very sharply is the extent to which we are supporting, you know, the struggling sectors, you know, also some type of spending. I'm not getting that conversation. And if I were to quantify, you know, what exactly is that, considering that, yes, you know, social relief is the one thing that is urgent now to get people food. But how are we ensuring that we are keeping from the provincial coffers? How are we keeping our industries, especially, you know, SMMEs in this regard? And my last one, I think, is on future scenarios, HOD and the team. Can you indicate to us in what you are saying, what would be those, and I mean, we're talking modeling here, which are not necessarily things that are going to happen, but I'm just saying, from looking at the entire, you know, public financing, what are the new things that we need to be considering, you know, as Parliament, in terms of how we future spend and try to raise revenue? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Nkondlo. And now the EFF is not on the line, so I will recognise Good.
Thank you, Chairperson. I have a few questions. The first one is about the slide that we saw where there were requests and COVID-19 requests, which I think totaled about 139 million, of which 18 million was allocated or approved. But I saw no requests amongst those from the Department of Transport and Public Works. And on Wednesday, we had the department discussing their quarantine and isolation planning and needs. And I mean, the numbers that we got on Wednesday were quite alarming, about 65,000 beds in total, 11,500 isolation beds and 53,000 quarantine beds. So I'm just wondering, first of all, why there is no request from Department of Transport and Public Works. My second question is, there was a procurement of 55 million rand by that department to establish the CTICC as a temporary hospital. So I assume, and I'm asking the question, whether that 55 million was from internal funding arrangements within the department if it didn't constitute one of the requests. But 55 million rand seems quite a high price to pay, given that the CTICC is already a building with infrastructure. So I'm not necessarily asking the department to comment on whether it's 55 million is appropriate. I'm trying to understand the source of the funding for that. And then staying with the quarantine and isolation infrastructure that's going to be required, we currently have 3,306 beds, according to Ms. Gooch, who was with us on Wednesday. We need to get to maybe about 65,000 in total, if those numbers, if the high trajectory is the path that we're on. And we need to get there by June, July, which is within the next 6 weeks. So I'm wondering how the Treasury is planning for that funding. I see that there was an amount of 1.8 billion for temporary hospitals in the budget pressures. But June and July, as I say, is around the corner, and I'm just concerned about meeting that deadline if the crunch happens. And then finally, just on the job numbers, the anticipated job share of 240,000 jobs, I'm just wondering what the parameters are that inform those numbers. Is it based on the lockdown happening when it happened and ending at a particular date? Because surely whatever happens next will inform the 240, what the job losses will be. So what are the parameters that have informed the 240,000 figure? What does it assume in terms of lockdown lifting? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Heron. I now recognise the ACDP.
Thank you, Chairperson. I've got a couple of questions, although some of the questions were asked. It's a very, very difficult job for the Minister and the Provincial Treasury with everything happening, because if I look at our national picture, it's very bleak with a construction of 5.8 and then 7.4%. And also, if we look, they've mentioned about the exploding debt and debt service costs. So that's all alarming, and the figures is not going down; it's going up. So it tells me with wage negotiations and all those things happening still, and as they mentioned, there will be additional disasters, and with the finance, the cake getting smaller. I just want to know, what is the province doing, and I think somebody asked that, but what is the province doing to look at generating own revenue? We know that our tourism industry is going under tremendous stress, job loss, and tourism in the Western Cape is a big phenomenon. And so you can, Tracy, just tell me what they're doing to assist that industry. That's we heard the other day that there's a lot of job losses, but also in the construction business. Maybe another question is, I also believe that municipalities, they've showed the municipalities in red. There's municipalities that is going to, even the tougher times for municipalities with people not be able to pay their rates and utility bills. And so they are in discussions with municipalities, but what is it's just people don't have money because of the lockdown, and people is not unemployed. So that demand is getting bigger, that people just cannot afford. And I hear about municipalities giving holiday breaks and those type of things, but money still needs to be paid and needs to be generated. Just maybe my final question is the almost 3.1 billion savings in the West Cape. Where is that going to come from? We know that we already, when you look at health and education, our biggest budgets, we are under tremendous strains. We don't have enough teachers. Classrooms is a problem. And I mean, the list goes on. Where are we as a province? Where are they as Provincial Treasury going to get that saving of 3.1 billion? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Christians. The Freedom Front Plus is not in the meeting today. So that then concludes this round of questions. Minister HOD, I'll then hand over to you to answer the questions, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to take a first stab at some of the questions, and then I'll hand over to the HOD and the department to reply, particularly to the questions that are more technical in nature. On the Honourable Bartman asked a question about the whole question of the 20 billion rand, which is going to be allocated to provinces for the health response. I think the point to make here is that there is a large degree of uncertainty at the moment about how that funding will be divided between the provinces. The formula that we've used to estimate our share is based on the provincial equitable share, but I emphasize that there's no certainty that national government will use the provincial equitable share to allocate those funds. And the Honourable Mackenzie raised a similar question and asked whether there had been conversations. There have certainly at a political level been several conversations about how those funds will be allocated, and also several conversations about urgently determining on what basis those funds will be allocated. But as I say, at least at a political level, there is still significant uncertainty, which we hope, as the HOD mentioned, will be settled within the next week. On the question of the payment of doctors, I will leave that to the department, and of course on the whole question of the 610 million rand and own revenue shortfall. On the whole question of entertainment, we have set out a range of expenditure items which we are going to take aim at, including entertainment, advertising, and consultants. But there is, as the HOD mentioned, we do not intend to put a moratorium on that expenditure, but we do intend to take a very careful look at those line items with a view to cost containment in the first phase of the budget process. Then the Honourable Nkondlo raised a question about our fiscal strategy. And I just wanted to point out that if one looks at the three phases which we've set out in the budget process, phase one starting with cost containment, phase two focused on a reprioritization. But really, if we take a careful look at phase three, we are really going to have to be looking at much deeper structural cuts. And essentially, we are going to have to relook at the size and shape of a provincial government in the Western Cape. So certainly our approach is going to have to change in order to accommodate much deeper budget cuts than we've ever anticipated before in the Western Cape. I think then there was a question again about municipalities, and perhaps that's where I'll end. I think the Honourable Christians is absolutely right. municipalities are going to be under pressure because households and businesses are not able to pay rates. And of course, that means that the municipalities that are already in a difficult position when it comes to liquidity, that situation is going to become so much more acute as we go forward. And it's precisely for that reason that Provincial Treasury are working very closely with municipalities to mitigate those issues going forward in the Western Cape. Thank you. With that, could I hand over to the HOD?
Thank you, Minister. Yes, in terms of the Honourable Bartman's question, the alternative model for the distribution of the health, the additional health financing would be on the trajectory of the pandemic and the demand that the epidemiological forecasts predict on the expenditure demand that flows from that. That I think highlights the importance of a data and scientific approach and a data-led approach to this. That's certainly something that National Treasury as well is trying to introduce, but there's no finality on that matter yet. So our estimations can't be based on an epidemiological model that's not yet as advanced to give us that data. But that work is underway. As I mentioned, it's not clear to us that the full 20 billion rand as part of the health response would necessarily be divided amongst provinces. And one of the top sliced items may well be the Cuban doctors in that respect, because there's not, to my knowledge, there is no formal agreement with the Western Cape in terms of picking up those costs. So it may well be funded purely from the national level and effectively top sliced off that or from another source. But again, on that, I can't give more specific information to the committee at this point. With respect to own revenue losses, we are projecting at the moment 160 million rand loss in motor vehicle license fees, shortfall in motor vehicle license fees, 350 million in gambling tax revenues, and 100 million rand in health patient fees against our projections. You'd asked on Honourable Bartman as well in terms of the savings items, and I think the Minister answered that well. For us, if we're really wanting to find deep savings, we need to dig deep. And we need to work with accounting officers in the individual votes to do that. And so we have a parallel process of our own review, our own technical deep dive into expenditure items and the targets that we've outlined, and we're asking accounting officers to do the same. So we can't give you any further information on that at this point. That is something that's underway. Remember, we can't fully calculate any savings that may have emerged or additional costs that have emerged from the lockdown because we're still in an advanced stage of that lockdown. So in a way it's ongoing, the generation of savings and costs in that respect. I think Honourable Nkondlo had asked the question around the fragmentation of social relief programs. That is a concern. The primary responsibility around the social relief is at the national level, and that's acknowledged by national government, and there's significant funding allocated to that. The response of the province has been to say, where do we fill the gaps that may emerge in that system? We do not want people falling through the cracks of that system, either because it's delayed in its implementation or because there's a targeting error there somewhere, an error of exclusion in one way or another that may lead to a family going hungry. And we're well aware that that's the case, and that's exactly why we have responded. It has been through multiple channels because it appears fragmented, but it's a backstopping device. So there was money that was given through a grant to municipalities. There was money with the Department of Social Development. There's money with the Department of Education. These are all filling cracks in the system. based on the assessment of where additional vulnerability may lie, and also, very importantly, on where our distribution, our ability to respond exists. So, you know, in relation to school feeding, there's established distribution networks and systems in that regard that can be very quickly invoked to give a response. At the same time, at the municipal level, municipalities do have detailed knowledge of vulnerable households in their communities, and so that is why that approach has emerged, and it looks fragmented. It is being managed in a consolidated fashion. There's a cluster of the provincial disaster response framework that deals specifically with that, and as we go along, our data is improving. Our ability to backstop more effectively and to monitor national progress in the rollout of relief is also improving. So it may appear fragmented. I think it's increasingly less fragmented, in fact. Future scenarios, I think that the minister had dealt with that question. We are clearly the models that we use for the delivery of public services are changing in any event, even as we speak. And I think even this committee meeting is an example of that, but it's going to change in very many ways. We're well aware that our education system won't be the same. This is a new normal we're adjusting to, and our delivery models and the costs associated with them will shift as well. And so, you know, when we look at the size and shape of government, we're also looking at what those changes to our delivery models are. Honourable Heron asked the question around DTPW and quarantine and isolation costs. Absolutely, we're well aware of those. The formal requests for funding, the approval of emergency expenditures have not come in to us, but we are aware that there are a number of them that are on their way. The approach that the Department of Public Works has taken with our support is to move ahead where it has authorization to spend in a particular area, to move ahead in obtaining services and provisioning itself, and that when the requirement is for an additional expenditure approval through the Section 25 process, that will be submitted through the conventional processes. Why we are aware of this is both because we are obviously engaged and partnering with the Department of Public Works and Department of Health as they mobilize to respond, but also in many instances there are associated indemnities and guarantees with things with the mobilization of facilities that the Minister of Finance is required to approve in terms of Section 66 of the PFMA. With respect to the Cape Town International Convention Centre and its conversion to a intermediate or field hospital, that is something that is financed on the DOH budget within their existing allocation for this for this year at the moment. That has been a from the province's side. It has been a partnership with the CTICC, and in fact the venue is being provided rent-free for that hospital. In terms of more broadly the mobilization and the time constraints associated with this, I think we are deeply aware of those time constraints and have been for some time, which is why teams are right across the provincial government are working really tirelessly in mobilizing the necessary facilities. It's important to note, I think, two things. The first is that the primary constraint is not initially financial. yes, these have huge costs, huge costs, and that's something that the Provincial Treasury monitors, manages, and advises on, and ultimately oversees. But the primary constraint is really our ability to mobilize those facilities to be fit for purpose. So a convention center is a good starting point, but it's not a field hospital, and quite a lot of work needs to be done to turn it into one. The same would be for quarantine and isolation facilities in order to meet the required specifications for those facilities. So the challenge is an operational one rather than a financial one in the first instance. The second point to make in that respect is that the trajectory of the pandemic across the province will be different. It appears that it will peak first and early in the Greater Cape Town area. That is not the case for the Central Karoo, and so the mobilization of facilities needs to be targeted to the demand at more of a local area level as well, to make sure that you're provisioning in the right places at the right times, and that is part of the challenge that Department of Health and Department of Public Works are addressing, and we've been involved in that process. The job loss scenarios that Honourable Heron raised as well, I think a very good point. The assumptions and the particular parameters of the model, I think it would be very useful for the committee to get a briefing from the Department of Department of Economic Development and Tourism. They have used a social accounting matrix model to do this with some deep econometric modeling. It is based on scenarios, on assumptions of the length of the lockdown. And so while it initially started out, when the work began, it was based on a core assumption of the initial period of the lockdown. There've been adjustments subsequent to that as well, and the model is capable of variations in those assumptions that vary the results. It doesn't, unfortunately, change a somewhat gloomy picture. It will obviously change the specific projections that are made, but the general thrust of those projections does not change. Of course, all projections become less accurate over time. So into the medium term, where we are attempting to make projections as well, there's more instability. That's why I was very careful to preface my comments on those slides with that residual uncertainties. But I'm very pleased that the committee is indeed interested in seeing the more detailed results of that model going forward. In terms of Honourable Christians's comment on the opportunities to generate additional provincial own revenue. Obviously, the fiscal assignments to the province are pretty limited at this point in our intergovernmental fiscal system. This is not necessarily an opportune moment to introduce additional taxation in the South African economy. For obvious reasons, that we would need to I think that the opportunities from the Provincial Treasury side that we see are perhaps more related to leveraged infrastructure finance for our infrastructure program, for elements of our infrastructure portfolio going forward. The municipalities, I think, is a very good point. The primary responsibility in terms of the law for the resolution of financial challenges in municipalities rests with the municipalities themselves. They have a duty in terms of the law to notify the provincial government should they be facing financial difficulties. We have not received formal notifications as yet, but we have proactively been in touch together with the Department of Local Government with a number of municipalities where we project there may be financial challenges going forward. And in fact, the Director General of the province convenes a Sunday night meeting with the municipal managers, myself and the HOD for local government and the HOD for economic development, so that we're able to stay fully abreast with pressures that are facing our municipalities, and then engage bilaterally as and when it is required. But the reporting from municipalities is obviously critical for us and critical for the public to be able to get a sense of the challenges that the depth of the challenges that our municipalities are facing. The big outstanding question is, where does that 3.1 billion rand saving come from that Honourable Christians had asked? That is precisely the objective of our budget process, in a multi-phased strategy-led budget process, in executing two adjustments. The first looking at cost savings, the second looking at strategic realignment, and the third looking much more deeply at the structure and functions and delivery models of government, the size and shape issues that the Minister had referred to. Honourable Mackenzie, you'd raised the question on a specific question on the procurement costs, and I'm sure Isaac Smith, who is with us, can give you very detailed information, but at a high level, you actually came up with the answer yourself. What is reflected there in terms of units are units of different sizes, so that there may actually be they're packing units or delivery units for masks, for instance. So that is definitely one part of the issue, that one manufacturer may pack in boxes of 100, one may pack in boxes of 20 or 50. The second part of that is supplier costs are different. We're not able, there are very few suppliers who are able to provide in the time that we have available the quantities that we require. And while we actively manage efficiencies and demand efficiencies and competition in our procurement, it means that we can't actually go to one supplier at one single price point. There will be variations in the price point, and that's embedded in our process. But I think Isaac Smith may want to just provide a little bit more detail for Honourable Mackenzie on that question.
Thank you, HOD. Maybe just to add on to what the HOD have indicated. Certainly, the idea was not to compare the unit cost with one another, as the HOD have indicated. It's various units of issue. Maybe just also to refer to the comment made by Member Mackenzie in terms of unit cost. What was quite clear from the beginning, that those frontline departments, in this case it was Health and Transport and Public Works, that had to make provision for, particularly in the transport industry and in the medical industry, of course, got lower prices than later on. What became apparent later on, when some of the other departments came to the fore, because it was not necessarily frontline requirements, is that some of the prices have escalated. We also worked closely with National Treasury, that also set some benchmarking for the prices as far as PPE is concerned. Of course, what you do get in this particular environment, there will be companies, particular middle companies, that wants to make profit out of this situation. So there are areas that we've also seen that some of the companies have put prices, quoted prices to us, which is much more than the benchmarking prices that was set by National. But it all comes back to timing. Even at this point in time, where we made use of the health contracts that we've put in place earlier, that quite a number of those orders were executed, but there are also orders that's outstanding for quite some time because of the availability of products in the market. And in that case, depending on the need, that also forces then the Department of Health to make use of other suppliers, which will mostly, in most cases, be more expensive than the contracts initially put in place. So it is a timing issue, and it is the availability of the products in the market. But as I've said, those departments that were early takers, I mean, they, of course, got the benefit of paying less than if we approach the market at this particular point in time.
I see that I have a point of order from Honourable Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, and I've, as I suspected, like some of these could be smaller unit or bigger unit, but as the presentation stands now, it will be obviously, this will be in the record. And like I always said when I served on SCOPA, when somebody sits at home on his own without the benefit of Mr. Savage and the MEC and the various officials there, that's how they're going to interpret this presentation. 480 Rand per unit, somebody department pay 75 Rand, somebody pay 15 Rand a mask. So what I would like to request the department just to send a clarification note that this can be attached for the record to this presentation, because as it stands right now, anyone out there 2 months from now or 6 months from now will look at this presentation and say the Western Cape Department of Education spent 400 Rand on a mask, Department of the Premier spent 75 Rand on a mask. So just for clarity purposes, if they can just send a clarification note that can go for the record with this presentation, so that whoever sits in the future doing their master's degree on COVID-19, because their research will indicate 487 Rand per quantity and 75 Rand per quantity. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Honourable Mackenzie. We will then request the updated program. Thank you. Minister HOD, would you continue?
Honourable Chairperson, I think we have, according to my notes, unless I've missed something, we've addressed most things. I see I haven't addressed Honourable Mackenzie's first question in terms of our engagements with National Treasury on the formula for the distribution of the cuts. Absolutely, we engage the National Treasury along with other provinces on a weekly basis through the Technical Committee on Finance, and the Minister does so at a political level through the Budget Council, and which I believe is also meeting on a weekly basis. We are in detailed discussions, both formally and informally, and as always, our view from the Western Cape is that we must have a fair system for the distribution of cuts that allows all provinces to navigate effectively through this crisis and maintain our financial sustainability over the medium term. That being said, this is clearly one of the most significant fiscal challenges that the Western Cape has ever faced. And we are going to be tested to our limits, and our partnership with National Treasury, a historically strong partnership, is also going to be tested. I have full confidence in the National Treasury team, of course, as I have confidence, as you can see, in the very strong Provincial Treasury team that we're well positioned to do so, though. That is it in response, unless there are further questions.
Thank you very much, HOD. We're then going to do one final, very brief round of questions just to check if there are any questions from members. If members would please keep them brief and to 1 minute, if possible. As usual, we'll start with the DA. Any final questions?
Deirdre Bartman, Chairperson.
Bartman, please proceed.
Thank you. With the tourism sector, I just want to understand, what exactly does the department mean by the tourism sector when there are job losses and the economic impact? Does this include hairdressers, barbers, shoemakers, spa stores, car washes? If not, what would the economic impact on those type of industries be and the job losses? In terms of the gambling industry, it's the majority of the provincial revenue estimated that will be lost, about 300 million Rand. I know previously the gambling board indicated that they were looking into online gambling and the research behind it and innovation. So I just want to understand what type of innovations are being used so that such provincial revenue is not being lost, as well as any innovation in the gaming industry, which we heard previously in SCOFT that they are doing research into. In the tech industry, I just want to understand, how are we as a department assisting the tech industry to help the informal sector to move into digital space at a reasonable cost? And finally, a follow-up on Honourable Hedren's question, and we received an answer saying that we're not paying rent for CTICC and we're buying beds, etc. I don't understand what specifically are we paying for in terms of the money. I know the province owns about 23% of the CTICC and Cape Town about 71%. So I just want to understand the breakdown. Chair, if I have any time left, I would like to give to Honourable Mackenzie.
No time left. ANC.
Chair.
Honourable Syed, please proceed.
Yeah, this is Member Syed. I'm going to be very, very brief so that I can give over to Member Nkondlo after this. With regards to the announcement by the Premier that the province has procured PPE worth 350 million, I just wanted to know if we could get details of the companies that are supplying the government with the PPE and the BEE status and criteria that has been used. And was the procurement part of a tender process, or what criteria was used? Then also with regards to the PPE procurement for schools in preparation for the reopening, I wanted to also get a sense as to what has been spent and also the details of the companies in that regard. And if we could get a breakdown of the quantity of PPEs that has been procured for each school. I don't expect them to give that here in this meeting, but if we can be furnished with that in writing. And then with regards to the small and medium enterprises, how do they get access to the procurement processes with regards to the PPE? Thank you. I'll hand over to Member Nkondlo sometime.
The time has expired. I'm going to recognize Good.
Chair, I have nothing further. Thanks.
Thank you. ACDP.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question. I see that, we always use provincial treasury, always use the reserves as a buffer. And now taking out money out of the reserves, what do they think is, we always speak about the reserve, the provincial reserve. What is because it's now down to 190 million, what is a sizable figure to, because the buffer is there in case of risks, what is a good figure to have as a reserve? That's the only thing that I want to know, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Christians. Minister Maynia and HOD, if you would be able to respond briefly to those questions.
Thank you. I will deal with two. The Honourable Bartman asked about the tourism sector. Now, as you know, in aggregate data, the tourism sector is actually subsumed within the trade sector. And so the Department of Economic Development disaggregates the data and then reaggregates it so that we have some sight of the effects in the tourism sector. As to the specific subsectors which you mentioned, I'm unsure of what subsectors make up the tourism sector in the aggregate data, but we could certainly provide a briefing to you or further information in writing about the model and its makeup and the effect in the tourism sector. Then the Honourable Furlong Christians asks a question about the reserves, which I think is pertinent, but I do want to point out that the 208 million to which he refers only to the unforeseen and unavoidable reserve, which we have committed to COVID-19. It does not refer to the fiscal stabilization reserve and the service load pressure reserve. So there still are, although we've committed the unforeseen and unavoidable reserve to COVID-19, there are still additional reserves. But of course, all this will have to be reconsidered, while strategy will be reconsidered, and our approach to the reserves will be reconsidered as we move through the budget process described by the HOD. Could I then hand over to the HOD?
Yes, please. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Minister. Honourable Bartman's question with respect to online gambling and gaming, most parts of that are actually prohibited by the National Gambling Act, we do keep an eye on it, obviously, because it does erode some of our gambling revenues. We do have an active research program, and as you know, the Cabinet has recently authorized the publication of 2 amendment bills in the gambling space, and I believe we will be briefing the legislature on that in the coming weeks. And so perhaps we can take that up then. As you know, gambling regulation and taxation is a relatively complex matter. There is, I think, from the Department of Economic Development is perhaps better placed to provide information on the support to the support for businesses to move into the digital space. There are initiatives underway in that respect, very hands-on, practical initiatives that the department and Wesgro have been working on. With respect to the CTICC, the specific cost items, again, it's the Accounting Officer for Department of Transport and Public Works who has the detail in this respect. But those costs, to my knowledge, are made up of electricity and water utilities costs, of which the City of Cape Town has steeply discounted to support this. The refitting and procurement costs associated with getting the facility ready, and then costs associated with security services and staffing and so forth, so that the facility itself can actually run, including catering and so forth for patients and that kind of thing. With the Honourable Sayed on the question of the PPE, local content and local companies, we stick firmly within the legal framework within this respect. We can provide you with further details both on the mobilization of PPE for schools. That's of course unfolding, so it's not that's a program that's kind of underway at the moment, and our reporting systems will inevitably be a little behind the reality just because of the way in which information moves. But we can certainly do that. As well as on SME access to the procurement processes. We've been very active in trying to encourage that, and I think that Mr. Smith had outlined some of the measures we took to crowd suppliers into our database for this initiative, and so to make sure that Western Cape companies were positioned to benefit from the procurements that are underway, and we can provide more detail in that regard on request. The local content requirements, I do understand, and I think my colleague Isaac Smith can correct me here. Aspects of the PPE, particularly more sophisticated PPE, local suppliers are struggling with stock themselves, which may create a risk going forward to procurement. That's obviously not the case with cloth masks, but more with the N95s and so forth, which have a fairly sophisticated construction. You know, certainly from the Provincial Treasury side, we are within the framework of procurement law and local content requirements, and as well as trying to actively manage risk to the supply chain and provisioning system itself. And then I think the Minister had answered the question on the provincial reserves. It's effectively, you know, the size of the reserve one maintains, certainly at a public finance policy level, is a function of your assessment of risk and affordability, versus competing expenditure needs. I think that the Western Cape's historical approach in this regard is now standing it in extremely good stead, and allows us to deploy our reserves as we are doing to make sure that we maximize our response and remove any financial blockages to the response to the disaster.
Thank you very much, HOD. With that, then we conclude the first part of the meeting on government finance and budgets. Minister, I don't know if you'd like to make any concluding remarks before we excuse you in the department.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to say thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee. I also want to thank the head official, David Savage, and the team finance for the hard work that they've put into preparing for this presentation, but also the hard work that they have been putting in supporting departments in our response to COVID-19 in the Western Cape. They really are doing a great job, and thank you very much to them, and thank you to you and your committee for the opportunity to present.
Thank you very much, Minister, to you and your team, and we wish you very well in the very difficult job that you have to do in support of the various government departments in these very difficult economic times. So we wish you all very well, and again, thank you very much for having responded to the committee's issues and questions in both the presentation and in the question session. Thank you very much. You may be excused.
Thank you.
We now move on to the second portion of the meeting, which is around cooperative governance. We say a very warm welcome to Premier Alan Winde, as well as the Provincial Director General, Harry Malila, to our meeting. And thank you very much for your time this afternoon and for sharing information on cooperative governance and the whole of society approach that the government is taking. Welcome, Premier.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Premier, I don't know if you'd like to make some introductory remarks before we hand over to the DG to introduce the team and to get into the presentation.
Okay. Yeah, just I think we don't have a lot of time because we also have to go into the next budget policy meeting, which starts at 5. So I'm not going to say too much. On the presentation, I will actually deal with the first few slides. I see there's DG. He'll actually put the presentation up. I'll deal with the first few slides, and then he will deal with the others. There's quite a long presentation, so I'm going to try and just go through the slides quite quickly, and also just listening to the meeting that you've just had. A number of those, or some of those numbers you would have probably had presented, etc. So I'll just kind of go briefly, but we'll leave this. I mean, you'll have the slides anyway for any further interrogation, etc. DG, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Premier, no, thank you very much, and also good afternoon, Chair, and also to the members. I just want to check from our side, can everybody see the presentation?
We can see the presentation, and we'd ask if it would be possible to conclude the presentation within about 20 minutes so that we do have time for questions as well, please. Okay, we can do that, Chairperson. Okay, excellent. Premier, I'm handing over to you, and I'll drive it from my side.
I've just asked for control of it. I'll just go ahead anyway. Have I got control yet?
No, I'm controlling it from my side, Premier.
All right. Okay. Thank you. This is the first slide. I'm not sure exactly whether the Treasury gave you any numbers this morning. This was actually the set of numbers that we put out in the week. But I do see that today there's a press release from Treasury which has got a bigger number on 1.14 billion, but so far 725 million, and it sounds like you've had a bit of a discussion on that so far. Budget and healthcare response. We've also had the hotline. You can see there 28,500 calls established since the 16th of March. I think the top. They were dealing with definitely over 14,500 calls at one stage in a day. The CTICC, which I see you've also had a discussion with, 850 beds. Yesterday, the first ward was actually handed over. So it's in progress to be completed on the 8th and hopefully before the 8th. Also, the other hospitals, the one on the R300, the one in Khayelitsha itself, the one in Khayelitsha also due to be completed before the end of the month, so next week. and the R300 a little bit after completion will be a little bit after the CTRCC, an additional hospital out in the Winelands. We have the ICU beds. We also have just come, DG and I've just come out of a meeting now where at a national level with the National Minister's Office busy finalising, because you would have seen we've also procured or looking to procure some extra ICU beds from the private sector, and that should be communicated probably in the next couple of days, as well as the 18 triage and testing centres. DG, you can go to the next slide. 3,888 community workers. I think if you can see the tests, I mean, here in this report, 94,000, we're already over 100,000. Testing is a big issue for us, and also part of the discussions that we've just come out of a meeting in. It continues to be a big issue for us. Testing has been the basis of how we've been trying to measure so we could manage, and it is a big issue for us in the province, but also a big issue for South Africa. That was our last testing ratio, 1347.27 per 100,000, still the highest in the country. The targeted hotspot approach, there was the total at that stage this week, I think it was Thursday, 473,000 screened, 12,095 tested, 62,000 people used our electronic screening tool. The volunteers, 1645 volunteers, health workers, we're hoping to use many of them in the field hospital space, but also I think our own staff, you can already start to see fatigue, so it's a big issue for us getting extra staff into the system, as well as utilizing these volunteers. The PPE, I heard the question earlier on the procurement, etc. I'm sure that detail will come through to you. And we're also pushing for PPE towards so that we can actually secure it going through for the rest of the year, as this pandemic is due to be with us for many months to come. The flu injections, we've given them not only to the vulnerable in our society, but also to our healthcare workers. Just want to see this thing's in the way here. There we go. And we have de-escalated non-essential healthcare facilities. I think it's all there. That's also part of the ICU beds. DG, next one. 432 ventilators and another 100 ventilators ordered. The Red Dot, I think everybody knows about the Red Dot minibus taxi service, not only for our healthcare workers, but also for our Q&I system. You can go, DG. This is the economic stuff. I heard you also in the previous meeting talking about it, and actually Savage talking about it. Here are all the websites that we've set up to enable businesses, to help them through the process. I see even here the PPE. We don't have a number here, but I know it's over 140 companies that are actually on the database, not only for us to procure from, but also we've made that database available to anybody else for the ability to procure. And those all of our support spaces that economic development have been establishing along with Westgrow. Here we've also got the Jump smart app that was launched during this campaign, the Go Digital. These are all the sort of DDAT or economic development processes and programs that were put in place during the last few weeks. Continued. Here you can see even right down to our own procurement of cloth masks, but it doesn't mention education. Education have also procured cloth masks. I think if I'm correct, it's 2 per child or 2 per learner, as well as for staff. And here, proven of protocols, seasonal workers. This was the protocol with the Eastern Cape. In actual fact, yesterday we had another meeting with the Eastern Cape Premier to take the learnings from the agricultural protocol. We're actually going to be using it now for funeral protocols. We are going to be revamping it. It was the Eastern Cape Premier, myself, and national ministers, along with our provincial commissioners, and we're developing a few more protocols on how people can move between provinces, because of course it is becoming a a risk for contagion, and we've seen a couple of issues there, and so it's really trying to tighten that up. Also, the export processes that were entered into between agriculture and DDAT to try and open up some of the economy. Go on, DG. Transport systems interventions. These have been linkages through to PPE that have been donated and supplied. Looking at the transport interchanges, cleansing of buses and taxis. There's a lot of intervention that transport has been involved in, and also right down to procurement of transport for specifically for nurses, for essential workers, continuing to monitor the system, also making presentations at a national level between the 50% and the 70% carrying capacity. We're still trying to push back to the 50%, and of course linkages through to not only this space, but now going into school transport. Carry on, DG. Driving public awareness. Obviously, this is about messaging. Yeah, you've got all the detail on who we've reached, what we've been putting on radio stations, from the adverts on radio stations, trying to encourage behavioral change. You'll see actually the new set of adverts coming out now, where we're actually asking policemen and women or nurses, etc., to be the front of the campaign, so we can continue with trying to drive behavioral change. But this slide gives you all of the, from posters to pamphlets to radio adverts to radio shows, right down to focusing in Dunoon, etc. And you will see the next wave coming is also going into the hotspots, so we can try to maintain or keep the messaging and the changing of the messaging within the hotspots. Carry on, DG. Disaster management response, obviously that's at the core of it, and run from the JOC. They also monitor quite a lot of what's happening on the ground, pulling everything together, linkage through local government, Department of Health, and I mean, there you also see the role that they played on repatriation of people that were here. Really, what we didn't want was to have even, foreigners, tourists that were stuck in South Africa, and then also being a burden on our health system. This was, I think, quite a good project, getting people to move back to their own countries. Carry on, DG. Municipalities. I'm going to go very quickly through here, but of course the municipal support, not only in getting basic services right, but also around extra. You saw the 16 million that we put through to municipalities to help them with their humanitarian response on food. Go again, DG. And then it links through, the next slide goes through to hotspots. It's the LEAP offices and how we work through the city of Cape Town with our LEAP, and of course also bringing together SAPS, the military, so that we can have a focus on the hotspots. I think, as you know, the SAPS, military and the city all sit in our extended cabinet every time we meet. Yeah, you can see also continually trying to find other ways of enabling the environment. We still haven't got the neighborhood watch system in place yet, but the Chrysalis Academy students being deployed at the moment. Next page, DG. And then the last, but really I think here, the environmental response, this page and the next page, talking about you know, what happens in with waste removal, and we set up those policies with waste removal right up front, early on. Making sure that people and systems dealing with waste disposal, looking at medical waste specifically from our hospitals. I mean, even if you think back to the CTICC, it wasn't just turning the CTICC into a hospital. You had to have proper protocols around waste management, and here how we pushed it across all of municipalities so that we could deal with risks within the pandemic. You can go again, DG, and I think this is the last slide. This is about the informal settlements, looking at how we can not only get water tankers in place, but it was also linking back to densely populated and how we can de-densify. I think there's another slide. Is there, DG? No.
This one is the health one.
And yeah, so now this is where I'm going to hand over to DG.
Premier, no, thank you very much. Chair, from our side, I'm going to provide you with an update on where we are from a health perspective. And then I'm also going to provide you an update on the whole issue around the hotspot strategy. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on the third request that you made around the issues around legislation. So I'm going to quickly take you through the slides. You will see that the slides contain a lot of detail because we thought that it's appropriate for you to actually have the detail so that when you get to the question and answer session, a lot of the detail is already there. And it's not just in the form of bullets. So this is the deliberate choice that we've made, from our side to provide you with as much detail as possible. And what I'm also asking is that the committee reads these slides together with the slides that myself and the Premier presented some 2 weeks ago in relation to COVID. So what we've actually seen from an epidemic perspective, I mean, it's a rapidly increasing epidemic with increase in hospitalization. I mean, you've all seen this. There's also concentrated in essential services clusters, and in fact, for the previous presentation where we spoke about the clusters, you will now see how we move from the cluster approach to the hotspot area. So what we've actually seen is a shift to care homes, and particularly within certain geographic areas, and effectively it's a spread that has actually happened within more of your poorer communities. And part of the presentation in relation to the hotspot intervention, we will show you what we've been doing within the noon, and also how we will actually duplicate that in the other hotspots that's been identified. There are some constraints, and it's the issue around the national testing and lab capacity. I mean, we've raised it now with the National Department of Health in the early meeting that myself and the Premier and the health team actually attended. Then there was also the issue around isolation and quarantine facilities that you're aware that you've actually scaled up, and you will see later in the presentation where I show you some of the numbers. And then the key issue is that there's a number of undetected cases, and those undetected cases, that number will grow because of mainly the limitation on testing. And this is something that the National Health Department has actually acknowledged. So it becomes important, to detect and then obviously to trace the number of positive people. We've more or less followed a similar approach in the rural districts, and you are aware of the issues, particularly within the Cape Winelands district, more particularly Witzenberg about 3 weeks ago. And what we've also seen is that these pockets are also now spreading to municipalities like Drakensberg, Stellenbosch, Breede Valley, and those municipalities are all within the Cape Winelands district. And then they also now starting to extend, to the Overberg region, particularly on the end to Theewaterskloof and Swellendam, and then sort of numbers also popping up now on the west coast, particularly in Swartland. I'm sure that you will understand, our capacity constraints, and also the fact that particularly in the rural areas, it's important to actually detect these cases quite early, and then to aggressively, move and apply isolation and quarantine interventions from our side. So, in fact, if you look at point 6, there's still a big value of individual cases detection and contact tracing to contain the spread of the virus, and that is what we're doing, particularly within the rural environment. Within the Cape Metro, and this is obviously also underpinned by our entire strategy around the hotspots, we're focusing on streamlined testing and contact tracing activities to focus on the high-risk groups, such as health workers and vulnerable groups, and you will see more and more of this as the epidemic unfold. Then there's an issue around emphasizing, case management with a view to early detection, particularly within the vulnerable groups, and as well as within the health workers. And then what we're doing, and again, you will see it now when I talk about the noon, is the issue around mass communication, the issue around pulling in the broader society, and the issue around pushing the accountability and community accountability agenda with the required behavior change initiatives. So it's about focusing on the vulnerable persons in these particular clusters, whilst we're still continuing with our initial stuff around screening and testing, and also obviously isolation and quarantining. So I'm sure you've heard, Chair, around our particular hotspot strategy. And what we found is that all 8 sub-districts in the city of Cape Town have now established community transmission and have recorded increasing positive cases over the past 4 weeks. I mean, Premier goes out every week and we share these things with the broader public, so I'm sure you're aware of that. The initial growth in cases has been linked with specific workplace clusters from the 3rd week of April. The geographic distribution of positive cases are clustered in specific location, geographic hotspot areas across the 8 districts. So that's linked to point 1. And then the hotspot areas with the highest density of cases are being targeted to limit the ongoing spread of the virus. And that is actually what underpins the entire hotspot strategy. This slide just gives you an idea or the differentiation between what is a cluster, and I'm not going to go into that detail because we've dealt with that previously. But the hotspots is really the specific geographic areas with many linked cases through local community transmission. And what the areas that we've prioritized, particularly within the metro areas, Tygerberg, Khayelitsha, Klipfontein, Dunoon, or basically on the western side, and then on the southern side, particularly Hout Bay. And in the rural side, we've also prioritized the Witzenberg, Drakenstein area. What we've done also from a coordination perspective, because I mean, we do believe that although it's a pandemic driven by health, but within the health cluster, it requires a whole of government approach. And if I talk about the whole of government, it's not just Western Cape government. It also includes the city of Cape Town as well as all the municipalities where we're seeing these hotspots popping out. So the HOD for local government is an overall coordinator. Then we've actually allocated each of these hotspots to a particular HOD. So Jackie Goods, HOD Transport, is driving Dunoon. Khayelitsha is driven by Gideon Morris, given also the previous work that we've done as part of the Khayelitsha Commission. Then in the Tygerberg area, Dr. Klute is driving that. And then Hout Bay is particularly sorted by Mr. Van Sail, as well as Mugale, who's the HOD for Transport and Public Works. And then the Klipfontein area is by Dr. McDonald, the HOD for Social Development. The hotspot strategy is aligned to what health is doing, and it's basically based on the risk stratified case management approach. And in fact, it's premised on the whole issue of behavior change, which includes social distancing, the issue around hand and surface hygiene, and the issue around mask wearing. And then the key thing is actually to make sure that we do not have gatherings, particularly in these hotspot areas. And we need to obviously nuance our approach, be agile, because not all communities are exactly the same. So we wanted to develop a blueprint through the Dunoon example, and then actually tweak it to be appropriate for each of the communities. The question, Chair, that you ask around whole of government and the whole of society is captured in this slide. So you can see the 7 streams that we focus on every second day as part of our cabinet agenda and cabinet discussions. And Premier has indicated that the municipalities are also involved in that. So it's the issues around health, the economy, safety, food security, places and spaces, transport, and then obviously resource management. And why I'm highlighting these points is that we'll see when I talk about the Dunoon that we're actually coming back to these issues. And then obviously from a whole of society approach, we've recognized we cannot do this on our own, and therefore we need everybody in the community to take accountability for what happens in their space. So it's about the role of councillors, community leaders, faith-based organizations, and then also the issue around caring and supporting. And then the key issue is the message around particularly behavior change. Chair, I'm probably going to take about 2-3 minutes just to show you the Dunoon pilot. And again, take note that we're trying to use the Dunoon as a blueprint, and for that then to be rolled out in the other areas. So we've developed a heat map, and that's the heat map of about 2 days ago. And obviously the numbers move on a daily basis. So we've got a whole set of people, sitting behind us and actually monitoring this. So it's basically along the N7 and then on the, western side of the N7. So it's that whole Dunoon area with a little bit, of a red area within the Burgundy environment. So what we've done with the Dunoon, we've said, okay, so what are the key themes? These are the themes. So it's the case management approach from health. It's the quarantine and isolation issues, both by health and transport and public works. Then there's a civil compliance part that is mainly community safety, the South African Police Service, the city, the Metro Police, and everybody that operates in the compliance space. And then it's also about how do we slow the spread. So it's about wearing masks, it's about social distancing and all those activities. And then there's also a human relief and food security part. So it's the responsiveness of departments like the Department of Social Development, the Department of Agriculture, and then importantly is the economic recovery. So it's the departments in that space. But the center part actually holds it all together. So it's how do we nuance our communication, our behavior change initiatives to actually make sure that we contain the spread within a particular area. I'm not going to deal with all the detail. Again, you've got it, Chair. So the next couple of slides gives you a little bit of breakdown of what exactly happens in each of these thematic areas. So if you look at this slide, you will see the following slides actually breaks it down. So this slide provides you with information on what health is doing, and it includes the issues around our healthcare facilities, our community screening and testing teams, and then also the issues around fatality management, and then also the issue around educating people to social distance, hygiene, etc. Then on quarantine and isolation, it's the issues of the red dot transport that Premier spoke about. It's about making sure that we manage movement. It's about wearing masks in public transport facilities. And then it also talks about the quarantine and isolation facilities that we need to bring online within these hotspot areas and also outside of the hotspot areas. And that little slide at the bottom, or that part at the bottom of the slide, gives you some sort of insight as to how we've gone about to identify these Q&I sites as close as possible to a particular hotspot. Then under civil compliance, it's the issues around SAPS, SNDF, Metro Police, traffic law enforcement. These are the stuff that is planned that we're going to do, particularly within the noon areas. It's about enhancing the protocols, at reducing the infection rate. It's about deploying people, in those areas where the numbers are growing, and then also about communities. Then I'm going to be done now, Chair. Then, Chair, these are the initiatives of DDAT, that's the Department of Economic Development and Tourism. It's about workplace safety. These are the initiatives that we're planning, that we currently have implemented, but that we're still going to also take to the next step, particularly within that department. Also, the City of Cape Town around sanitizing of transport facilities, hygiene and sanitation, the role of cleaning communal toilets, the role that the city need to play within the space. The next two slides deals with the humanitarian relief and food security. These are the different departments, Chair. You can see that we've already delivered about 30,000 of the 50,000 food parcels that's been provided, particularly by our department. There's also the work that's been done by the NGOs from a whole of society approach, the work through the action networks, and then there's also the issue around particularly donations. And you can see there's even further work that we're planning in this space. Obviously, important is the economic recovery phase, and you can see we're currently busy with doing economic impact modeling on the various scenarios. We're busy developing a city recovery plan, and the Department of Economic Development have had many engagements with local businesses, particularly in this space. And then this slide also provides you with some of the planned initiatives. Importantly, Chair, we've realized that we need to shift our game in relation to communication, because we can only deal with this through proper behavior change. So our key initiatives over the next while is going to focus on community education and awareness. It's about making people aware of what's happening in the space, using some of our EPWP workers, our community development workers, advancing issues around social distancing, hygienes, putting up posters in each of these hotspot areas so that people know what is actually happening within their space. There you can see it's mass communication, but obviously targeted. It's initiatives around engaging with community leaders, also on a targeted approach. So it's about having a bespoke approach in each of these communities. So, Chair, This slide, just to conclude on this part, and then the other part just deals with the issues around legislation. And I've already spoken about DLG together with the Department of Health responsible for coordination. We're applying the joint district management approach. And then it's about following a differentiated approach to each of the hotspot areas, but focusing on the vulnerable spaces, the vulnerable people, to reduce the spread, and pushing the entire agenda of following a whole of society, a whole of government approach to actually institutionalize permanent behavior change in these areas. Chair, you've also asked us to just comment on, what currently within the legislation either help us or hinder us in the fight against COVID. I think it's important to actually talk about these issues. And I mean, I maybe need to also make the point that we've also written, the Premier particularly have written to the President to actually highlight some of these issues. And then you will see in 2 slides from here, I'm also talk about what is it that we're doing in this space. So we're not just looking at, what in the legislation is hindering us, but we're also looking at what are the solutions to deal with these things. So we believe the Disaster Act is conducive to fast and agile regulatory responses to the disasters. But it doesn't only stop there. The Act also assigns primary responsibility for the management and coordination of the national disaster, and that's effectively by the national executive. It empowers provincial governments and municipalities to support the national executive, which means that all 3 spheres of government must work together and consolidate resources, capability, capacity to manage the disaster. Now, that's written in the law, and what we're saying is that it's not always practiced. So at the moment, we've taken it up now with our national department, the fact that there's limited consultation happening in this space. And although we're providing input into the draft, either regulations or directives, we're seeing that there's a limited number of these things are being taken up in the final regulations. So although the Act contemplates that all 3 spheres of government must work together, and we're enjoined by the Constitution, in reality, that's not always the case. What we're also saying in relation to this slide, what we're saying at the moment, it's quite difficult for us to play, and to execute our role, given the fact that that we are not always being listened to, or our advice or our comments are not always taken into account. And also what we're seeing happening in the space is that even the request for commentary sometimes comes in at number 99. In fact, I mean, I personally have an experience where they've requested us to comment at about 10:30 in the evening, and they've asked us to give comments before 12 o'clock that evening. So what we need to do is we need to institutionalize a process, and we've asked the President to do that, to make sure that that particularly on the consultation side, that we actually up our game. Because at the end of the day, we all in this together. I've spoken about the issues around intergovernmental relations, and in our space, what we're doing, notwithstanding those issues that I've raised early on, I mean, particularly from the Premier side, there's active participation by him and myself in the President's Coordinating Council. Those meetings happens at least once every 2 weeks. I mean, it goes on for 5 hours, etc. And that's the opportunity where the Premier actually places our issues on the agenda. From the PTM side, as well as from my side, through FOSSET, etc., we try and put these issues on the agenda. And then I think from a legislative perspective, in relation to IGR, obviously we involve the municipalities, we involve the district municipalities, as well as the city in each of the streams that we've actually put together. So, Chair, in closing, I mean, the Premier is in contact with the President and the national ministers regarding our COVID-19 response. I mean, he's quite active, and this government is quite active in this space. Our MECs engaged national counterparts on a one-on-one, as well as through the MINMEX. And then I have spoken about the fact that on an administrative level, we also engage. And then Minister Bradell, who's responsible for local government, also meets with the municipality regularly. And even administratively, PTM meets weekly, and we also meet on a weekly basis with all the municipalities. So, Chair, that more or less takes care of our presentation. And I mean, I don't know whether the Premier maybe wishes to make some concluding comments before I hand back to you. But thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee members.
Thank you very much, DG.
Premier? Go straight to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're then going to have a round of questions. As usual, we're going to have a 3-minute round, starting with the DA. Are there any questions from the DA?
Yes, Chairperson. Ricardo Mackenzie. Can I start?
Yes, please.
Thank you. My first question would be to the Premier and partly to the DG. As you know, we got a lot of public buildings and we have the Wi-Fi project on public buildings like libraries, etc. Has there been any consideration for redirecting those resources to kids at school or the kids at home, because people obviously are not using that free Wi-Fi at the moment? And secondly, when it comes to the meetings, and I saw that the Premier last Saturday, and I think that he meets every Saturday with the President and other Premiers, has there been a discussion around moving down to level 2 immediately? I saw business owners said level 3 is still going to kill him. Has there been discussions about moving to level 2 from the 1st of June? And did the President give an indication from when exactly on the current discussion are we moving down to level 3? Is it the 1st of June or is it likely to be before the time? And then the Premier, with a meeting with the President and the other Premiers, and I saw your e-news interview the other day, and I obviously know that you can't share confidential information, but as you get from the other Premiers in the country, do you get support in moving down one level? Because I did see that
Honourable Mackenzie, you on mute.
Deputy Speaker, I mean the Chief Whip.
I can hear you now. So we heard up to the point if he's getting support from other Premiers.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. And then lastly, in terms of the consultation with the private sector, a few weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago, the Premier mentioned that they had a discussion with, I think, 80 epidemiologists. Are those discussions ongoing? And do they give input into our current COVID-19 strategy? And then lastly, when it comes to the testing, and we know that the private sector, I myself went for a test and I got my results back within a day and a half the other day, and I'm proudly negative. But has there been discussions about using more of the private sector and government paying for services for the private sector because of the delay with national government testing? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Mackenzie. I now recognise the ANC.
Chair.
Honourable Syed, please proceed.
Yes, Chair. Chair, I just wanted to get a sense whether there's been a consideration to look at a multidisciplinary and multi-sectorial response teams that could attend to COVID-19 and some of the other issues of social security and health issues such as TB and HIV, or maybe whether this COVID period has probably given the Premier and his team an opportunity to look at dealing with our health issues in that particular manner. Then I wanted to get a sense, given the rise in infections amongst health workers, and some of the info at our disposal, which indicates, for example, that 219 cases, including 150 at the Tygerberg Hospital and 69 nursing staff at Grooteskiel. I wanted to know, in addition to providing basically PPE, what other measures are taken to minimize the risk of the spread? What measures are taken to decontaminate the wards that have been affected, to test and to isolate staff after positive cases have been confirmed. And lastly, given the number of complaints and tensions between the management and staff in various healthcare facilities, whether the Premier would consider establishing a COVID-19 health facility response team, which will include management and union representatives, Chair. And then lastly, from a communications angle, the Premier spoke about the communications aspect. In my constituency alone, I've picked up, and I raised it in the House yesterday, where you'll find ward councillors that will then go, after the Premier has issued a statement about stats, then you'll find ward councillors going and debunking the statement publicly. I just wanted to get a sense as to what mechanism do we have to ensure that there's one message with local government as well, and particularly with ward councillors and in terms of stats, because it seems as if the Premier speaks and then you've got ward councillors singing their own tune. I just wanted to know if we cannot maybe have one uniform message in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Syed. I'll now recognise Good.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, I want to just talk about the health protocols and some of the information that we've just received. As I understand it, the health protocol is community screening, testing, isolating the positives, identifying their contacts, reaching them, and quarantining those contacts. So that's more or less, in a simplified way, this process. Now, the presentation says that in the Western Cape, we've done community screening of 473,000 people. But that number seems very low when you look at the national figure, which is at about 11 million people. So I'd like to understand why our community screening numbers are so low compared with the national number and the rest of the country, given that I think we probably have the most capacitated province in the country. Then I want to understand this hotspots. The presentation identifies Tygerberg in Cape Town, Khayelitsha in Cape Town, Klipfontein, Dunoon and Hout Bay as hotspots. But every day we get a little slide that tells us where community screening and testing is taking place. And I see that over the last few days in Cape Town, the screening is only happening in one site. So for example, I think today you are in Durbanville, and yesterday you were in. Today you're in Cheshire Home, in the Klipfontein area, but in the rest of the province you're like in Wolseley and Ceres and Gouda and Saron and Beaufort West and Paradise Valley and Thembalethu. So I don't understand why, with Cape Town having all of these hotspots and seeming to be where the most infections are, why are we only at one site in Cape Town doing screening today, and in the rest of the province we are in multiple locations? And it looks, I've been watching over the last few days, it seems to be a pattern in this last week. The week before there were three locations in Cape Town. But why? I don't understand why there's only one site that we're at Cape Town, and why these sites, why Cheshire Home, and why the Woodside Children's Home, and why the Durbanville Children's Home. So I need to understand that. And then finally, with regards to the end of the process, the contact tracing, why is the per capita contact tracing number so low? And this is not only a Western Cape problem, it seems to be a national problem, but the number of contacts that we've identified is fairly low compared to what the experts are saying we should expect each positive case to reach or to have come in contact with during the infectious period. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Heron. The ACDP.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Just a couple of questions. The pilot at noon, how long is that pilot in operation, and is that pilot, if it's successful, going to be extended to the other hotspots? Now, bearing in mind when you have other pilots and other areas as more resources, more. Is it possible then to do it? Because more resources, law enforcement, all of those things needs to be done. So how long, and is it the new numbers, checked on a regular basis to see that there is a stop in the spread? Just something about that. And then the Premier has said previously that there's more deaths of the COVID-19 in private hospitals than public hospitals. If he can just explain that. And then there is a rumor that, and I just want to know if it's true, that not all cases, people that die, not all cases is COVID cases. They make it COVID cases. I think you heard about that. Not all cases is COVID cases, but they put it down as COVID cases. If maybe just elaborate on that. It's just a rumor, or is it true? And then the ventilators, I know there's 432 and 100 ordered. Is that enough according to the modules? So if we hit a peak, is those ventilators enough, and is that sufficient? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Christians. That then concludes this round of questions. Premier DG, I'll hand over to you to answer them, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll start, and I'm sure DG will back me up. So first of all, Honourable Mackenzie, thank you very much. Your question about public buildings, well, obviously schools were never able to be used, but you spoke about other facilities. It is something that is being spoken about. I think you know that most of the public spaces were put on an initial list for the need for probably extra beds or extra triage systems. So you would have found town halls and library halls, etc., would have all been on that initial list. DG might remember the number, but I mean, there was lots and lots of facilities on that initial list. I do know there's a bit of a discussion happening at the moment, specifically around some of our public spaces, like our town halls, community halls, and library halls, especially if they do have Wi-Fi connection. And I know that the Education Department, Minister Bradell has been driving this to say, how do we actually make these available for the Education Department if there needs to be decanting, so you have to have less, creating social distancing. But that's all that I've got on the answer to that part of the question. Your questions around discussions at the PCC. Number one is that there was no real sort of focus on level 2 in that discussion. I think we were asked to all comment on the existing and our plans to go towards level 3, what each province was looking at. And of course, each province put what they felt on the table. Of course, that was post a presentation from the Health Department, as well as that from Dr. Mkhize, but also the Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, because they started to put the initial strategy on, metros should stay in 4 and the rest of the country could go to 3, perhaps maybe 1 or 2 districts not. But that was the basis of the discussion. And obviously we put info into that discussion, and then that goes into the Command Council. In actual fact, since the PCC, the President has engaged with the political party leadership in the country and business, etc. So there's been a whole range of other platforms for discussion. Then what kind of support the other premiers? I mean, we have a good discussion, and quite frankly, that meeting that we had yesterday with the Eastern Cape and a couple of national ministers came out of a discussion that we had in the PCC, raised by Minister Becky Cleary, and it started off just around policing, but then linked through to policing and border migration between provinces, and that led to that next meeting. So, we don't only necessarily discuss the levels for economic activity or lockdown. We discuss all sorts of things, and then different meetings come out of that meeting. And I mean, it's a good discussion. Then you spoke about the private sector and engagement with the private sector. And obviously there's different levels of engagement with the private sector.
I think we've lost the Premier.
He's coming back.
There we
He's
go.
coming back.
Sorry, Premier, we lost you for a moment there.
You're on mute, Premier. You're on mute.
You're on mute, sorry.
It suddenly came up and said
Got
you've been removed. You've been removed from this. I didn't know you had such a button. That's a nice
Very
one.
welcome here.
Thank you. Obviously, there's lots of engagements with the private sector. DDAT engaged, the health department engaged, and even in our own system, reporting back to cabinet. I mean, there's the private sector as in business, but there's also civil society. So there's ongoing meetings led by Minister Mbombo, who meets with, especially on the hotspots, but takes it sort of a district, either district level or as in a city, will be the political boundaries that kind of align as close to as possible as to the health sector spaces. And they will have these meetings. So they had one, I think it was last night, and it's all councillors, all politicians and communities are invited. And then, of course, you spoke about the 80 specialists that were invited by Norma French and Mbombo to come and talk to us. That specific meeting was about death and our numbers and our percentages. At the moment, we've just had a report come in from our engagement last week with the Masha group that is based out of UCT, and I think gives a lot of sort of advice to the national modelling as well as the Actuarial Society, and we will be presented on Sunday at our normal Sunday meetings with the health department on where we've or that private sector engagement and if there's any influence on our existing scenarios. So I mean that carries on and happens all the time, where there's much civil society and private sector involvement that we can get. Then the Honourable Said, thank you very much. You spoke about a multi-sectoral response team. I mean, I think that's what this whole of government and whole of society is, a multi-sectoral response team. So it's not just health, it's everybody that's involved in each of these hotspot responses, definitely making sure that we try to bring everybody on board. Then your second part was about balance between COVID-19 and the other health demands. And of course, our system, both public and private, have actually moved elective surgery out of the way, etc. And of course, we're seeing all of these reports at the moment that during lockdown, specifically triggered by lockdown, but also right now, how people are reticent to go to health facilities. And so we also are probably picking up a problem where we're probably not detecting cancers early enough. There's definitely a whole lot of other societal health issues that are probably now really under strain, and it is trying to get that balance right. Then you spoke about health workers, and it is a big issue. You also spoke about also unions and maybe a management type structure, but I can tell you specifically in the health sector, the unions as well as the health management have regular meetings. I mean, more regular than once a week. Yeah. They're meeting all the time because, of course, it is a very difficult issue. You mentioned 150 at Tygerberg and 69 at Groote Schuur. Now, I remember seeing on the health WhatsApp group this morning between the minister and Dr. Kluti on the 150 people at Tygerberg, and I think it is those numbers were corrected to 59 who have already recovered and 43 or something like that that are positive at the moment. So, obviously there's also sometimes some mischief, I think, in some of the numbers that are put out. But what I can tell you is that no matter what, there's no sugarcoating here. It is a very stressful environment for our frontline workers, and not only for our frontline workers in health, our frontline workers across government. I mean, we spoke about it again at Cabinet today. DG's got all sorts of plans through HR and .P to deal with various issues that face our 84,000 people in our workforce. And of course, I think it's across the board. Anybody that's on frontline is definitely feeling it. And then your last point around councillors' messaging. I mean, of course, we've taken it upon ourselves to say that we will want to make our data available. I see today newspapers take that data and then create their own hotspot maps in the newspapers. Of course, councillors can take that data and, you know, deal with it. I think sometimes, you know, it becomes difficult to deal with because we know, and that's why we didn't put the granular slide up at ward level. We pulled that back at the last minute because if you use the health granular slide, you've actually got a dot on an earth number. And I think that really is going to be counterproductive. So we've asked them to kind of blur that dot a little bit so that you can't say, you know, it's the next door neighbor that's infected. We need to say that sort of in this area or in this street, there are probably five cases. So that, but we really want to make the data available as granular as possible. And hopefully by next week, we can make it more granular. But it's also got to be at the same time, we don't want to have victimization and some of the negative stuff that goes with making the data open. I'm not going to dictate to councillors. Obviously, one message is always better, but I mean, they must also be able to have their say. With regard to screening and testing, the Honourable Heron, maybe just once again, remember, in the Western Cape, we started off with two kinds of screening and testing. The one is the screening and testing. In this report, I think we were 400 and something thousand. We're probably over 500,000 now, with about 12,000 tests to the 500,000. That's what happens across the country. I don't know how the country gets the numbers that they get, but when our team goes to screen and test, they've got a range of questions that they ask. They've got to arrive at your door. They, some of them could even take your temperature, but they arrive at your door. On average, I'm told it takes around about 5 minutes to do a screening. And then obviously that either gets just logged or gets reverted for testing. That is the most basic that gets used. I mean, I'm not, and I haven't done any cross-questioning in other provinces, but I saw Limpopo did 1.7 million screenings in 10 days. I mean, I don't know if that's possible or not. But I don't think it's possible at 5 minutes a screening and you've still got to get from door to door. But anyway, screening and testing, our numbers are there. That's what we've done. Unfortunately, we're getting to a stage now where it's becoming very difficult to follow that basic model of screening and testing, because even the screening and testing results in that randomized model does not give you high, you know, a high response to or a high positive rate. You're not really tracking the cases. Then we started quite a few weeks ago in retail is where we really started it, and of course in our own clinics and police stations where we were, but really it was retail and factory spaces where we would pick up a positive. This was still in lockdown level 5. We'd zoom in, and I mean that's a second kind of testing, and that was our targeted testing. That model that we used, I'm very pleased to see that it's now being used in the Eastern Cape and Gauteng as well, which I'm very pleased about. And then there's a third round of testing, which is the hotspot testing. And what you were referring to, which we advertise every day, is the number 1. That's the first round of testing where we go into communities wherever they are, and we have a whole sort of range from across the province of where we would go door to door. That's the 500,000. The targeted is not advertised, but we go directly into a factory or into a workspace, and we test 3 shifts, and we test management that move, and then we also test the contacts. There again, I mean, you've got comparing provinces. I don't know about how the other provinces do it. All I know is that when we ask the question of our health department, you know, you should have probably 5 contacts, maybe 10. That it's not always that easy to get to those contacts. And so sometimes our numbers are lower than in other provinces. I'm not sure. We're just putting on the table what we get to, how we find, track and trace, and that's what we get. I mean, I even take tracking and tracing of people who are positive. The Honourable Dugmore, I don't know if he's on the line now, but sometimes he would send me, I know in the week, he sent me, I think 2 or 3 people's names to say they've tested positive and they're not in the quarantine or isolation facility. And then I'd go through to Dr. Wayne Smith and the guys at the JOC, and then you'd get a message back an hour later, we still can't find the person, they, elusive, and then they're not at their address, and it's not that easy, but we put it on the table like it is. And then the last one in the hotspot. The hotspot testing is a different regime. There, each hotspot gets divided into, depending on the size of the hotspot, into a number of spaces where they then in turn get a senior operator, they get screeners, they get medical people assigned to it. Sometimes it's 3 in a team, sometimes it's 5 in a team, and they move across that space. If you want deeper detail than this, then obviously this is what you must be asking to the health department. If I can also talk for the first hotspot, which was Witzenberg. And of course, when I went to go and visit to see for myself, I mean, there were whole teams moving through street by street. And of course, that is in a hotspot and wouldn't be on that daily advert that goes out to where community screening and testing happens, because there's a dedicated team that is assigned to that hotspot to test as much as possible. And of course, that also now raises another issue, which is really concerning to me. And we've hit a real wall when it comes to testing in South Africa, just like many countries have also hit the wall where you can't get enough testing through. But I am pleased to say that it was either very early this morning or late last night, we received a letter now from the NHLS to say that we could procure private sector testing. Although when we engage the health department on it and private sector, it's not going to give us that much relief, because the private sector is also bottlenecked quite severely. So it's a big problem for South Africa. Then the next, Honourable Christians, I think it was, around, I've got here, Witzenberg, the pilot in Dunoon. So remember, Dunoon is the first in-depth, different model to the Witzenberg model. Of course, we're running all of these at the same time, but the Dunoon one is which we use today as the focus area. But Witzenberg was the first one to take place. Now, I mean, the numbers are looking good as long as I can trust the testing, which I don't know how many tests in Witzenberg are in backlog, but it already looks like the whole of government and whole of society approach in Witzenberg, those numbers are cooling, which is really good news, because then we seem to be slowing it down. Obviously, the numbers there are much smaller because it's a rural area to a Dunoon or a Khayelitsha or a Tygerberg. But of course, we will see now over the next 2 weeks probably whether our interventions in the pilot are going to be effective, and whether we're seeing change. The point that I think you raised, I'm pretty certain that it was, I'm not sure where you heard it, but if I think about the wording, more people die in private sector hospitals than in government hospitals. That's not the case for the Western Cape, definitely not the case for the Western Cape. But I was referring to the numbers in Gauteng. Somebody asked me a question about the numbers in Gauteng. And in Gauteng, it was only in the private sector that you saw COVID deaths. You saw very few COVID deaths in the government sector. So I raised a question. I was saying it in a question mark, with a question mark rather than as a statement, because I don't believe it. It can't be that you don't die in that province in a government hospital. And then you spoke about the ventilators. We've ordered another 100 ventilators, but of course a ventilator is just a machine. It has to be put into an ICU facility. It has to have staff that operate it. And we said it right up front that our model says to us that we're going to be 750 ICU beds too few in this province. And that's private sector and government sector. Right now, as we speak, we're busy finalizing. You sort of were seeing in our report that we're actually buying 300 private sector ICU beds for our use. We're still busy in that negotiation. It happens at a national level, but that should be able to be announced very, very shortly. And then you also wrote about, I've got you 15% and 11%. Those are the post-mortem percentage tests that we do. And I think that number is actually growing. If I look every time I get the stats in the evening, maybe DG can confirm this, I think it's getting more, where people that die, we actually don't mark them down as death by whatever the cause of death is, cancer or diabetes or hypertension. If they have any symptoms, we still test them. And so it was 15%, it dropped to 11%, but I think it's gone up again. We do post-mortem testing because obviously we need to be able to understand it. And I don't think it happens anywhere else. But it is part of our testing regime, because at the end of the day, whatever happens, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's why testing is so critical in any country in the world when it comes to this virus. And again, that's why I say the frustration that we are hitting a wall with testing at the moment is a very high level. Chair, I'm going to hand to the DG if there's anything he wants to add to that.
Thank you, Premier. Chair, if I can just add a couple of points. I mean, myself and the Premier just came off a meeting with our national colleagues, that's national health team. And I mean, some of the commentary that they've made is, I mean, they believe that under the circumstances, the Western Cape is doing well. They acknowledge that the environment has changed. And the one thing that I think I need to put on the table, the comment that's been made is that the Western Cape is actually the blueprint for what is going to come in the country. So all the initiatives that we're doing here, I mean, we're the first in South Africa to be hit really by the COVID virus. So everything that we're putting in place here is going to be used or can potentially be used when some of the other provinces see the numbers are starting to spike sort of in their space. So in relation to the staff, and I mean, we've acknowledged that at the moment, I mean, the amount of fear and stuff that sits not just only in the staff at health, but also in relation to staff in other areas, like in education, like in social development, is that we need to do something to at least get the messaging out to staff. So what I've reported this morning to Cabinet is that also institutionally, I'm putting processes in place now to communicate more regularly to the staff. I'm also explaining, stuff like return to work on policy, and just the positive messaging to staff, particularly within the health space, that we appreciate what they're doing. And in fact, we're even making a call even to our national colleagues for, nursing staff, medical staff that sits elsewhere in the country at the moment that doesn't see these kind of spikes, for them to potentially to come here to help us. And when we get to the other side of our peak and we see this happening in other provinces, that we actually then send our staff to those provinces to come and help. Because, I mean, this is it's not a Western Cape problem, it's a country problem, and we all need to fight this together. So, Chair, even from, I think, a modeling perspective, I mean, from where I'm sitting, institutionally, I mean, we do not just sort of go and suck the stuff out of our thumbs. Our forecasting scenarios are actually validated against nationally and internationally accepted models. So we test it every week. We ask the hard questions around our modeling. And at the moment, as the Premier said, our models are now being validated and tested against the ASHA and the MASHA models. And these are models that's been put together by the universities and stuff like that. Maybe just one or two issues on the hotspot areas, as Premier has indicated. I mean, the Noon is a pilot, and we want to take the learnings from the Noon and try and implement it in those other areas. But obviously, recognizing that communities are different, but we want to take the principles and actually apply it in some of those other areas. Chair, there are some constraints, and I mean, it's also what we've raised with our national colleagues, and I mean, we made the point even on Thursday. The biggest constraint in this space, and then I'm sure David Savage has also raised it earlier, is the issue around certainty on funding. I mean, the health department at the moment is projecting to spend something like 2.5 billion rand just on the COVID initiatives. This now falls outside of what other departments still need to do. And that also doesn't take into account the potential massive ramp up that will be required under quarantine and isolation facilities. And at the moment, there's no certainty on funding. There's no certainty on what portion of the 20 billion, as an example, that's been set aside nationally will come, to the Western Cape. So effectively, we now need to deal with that stuff either from our own resources, or we need to ask some of the other departments now to start to chip in on this. But just lastly, on the IGR, and I mean, Premier has confirmed it, that we're really also stepping up our game on IGR and having, the discussions with National, because we're all learning this space. It's all new to us. We're learning from international best practices, but what we're also seeing in some of the areas, we're dealing with certain unique issues, because obviously the way that we put together in relation to, some of the first world countries are in fact unique. But Chair, the point is really that we're learning. We know we are the blueprint for the country, and whatever we do here, we will document it and share it with the rest of the country to make sure that we can actually deal, with the fallout of COVID. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Premier and DG. Thank you very much for your time spent with the committee. Thank you for preparing all that information for us and updating us on what's going on with the hotspot models and the whole of government and whole of society approach. I do understand that you have a meeting now. It's 5 o'clock. So we thank you very much. We might send a few questions in writing if that's in order. And we wish you very well with a very difficult task that you have at the moment, and the very best that you're doing for our province and its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, members.
Cool.
Right, if the members could stay behind, please, just for a short amount of committee administration. As usual, I'd like to ask that if there are any questions to either of those departments that briefed the committee today, if you could please send any resolutions, questions or requests for information to the procedural officers by 12 noon on Monday. Then I would like to flag that the next ad hoc committee meeting is scheduled for Wednesday at 1 o'clock on the theme of citizen surveillance. I just would like to alert members that we have not received confirmation as yet from the National Department of Health and the National Department of Communications. We are in correspondence with them, and we've sent letters to hopefully the correct people now. So I'm hoping that we will have confirmation by Monday, but I just put it out there that to date we don't have confirmation as yet. Then a meeting thereafter, we will be looking at citizen engagement, and also we have an upcoming briefing from the Department of Health. So I'd like to ask Honourable Philander, and actually as Chair of the Health Committee, but all members of this committee, that if you have anything in particular that you would like the Health Department to brief us on in that meeting, if you could please submit so via email, then we can include that in the request for the briefing from the Health Department in early June. It's just over a week from now. Then I would like to extend thanks on behalf of this committee to our procedural officer, Mr. Wasim Matthews. We thank him very much for his service to this committee as a procedural officer. His service to this committee is ending today, and he rejoins his usual standing committee. And we thank him for his professionalism and very hard work after the last week since this committee was established. So thank you very much, Wasim. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Are there any matters under general that committee members would like to raise? Going once. Going twice. All right, thank you very much for your robust engagements of the two departments. I wish you all a good evening, stay safe, and we'll see you next week. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, bye-bye.